darkness falls, the line between reality and nightmare fades. This is the realm where fear reigns, and you. Welcome to the dark tales of Mr.BlackDread. 400. Last night, number 5. Last night, a friend rushed me out of the house to catch the opening act at a local bar's music night. After a few drinks, I realized my phone wasn't in my pocket. I checked the table we were sitting at, the bar, the bathrooms, and after no luck, I used my friend's phone to call mine. After 2 rings, someone answered, gave out a low raspy giggle, and bus driver at number 4. When I was a kid, I was always the last kid to get picked up by the bus driver to go to school. One day, I was waiting for the bus by myself, and a bus with no kids pulled up. The bus driver smiled and told me to hop on. I just had a bad feeling. I said, "Where are the other kids?" He said, "We will go get them now. Just get on." He got more and more pushy, but didn't do anything crazy. I just kept saying no, and he shrugged and left. The real bus pulled up a few minutes later. I went to school, and my parents didn't know until I mentioned it that night. Looking back, they were pretty worried. I remember them scrambling to make a few phone calls. The lady next door a few years back, I rented an apartment from a friend of mine. He had recently bought it and had it completely renovated. He put it up for sale but couldn't find a buyer, so I offered to rent it in the meantime. After moving in, I realized there was something wrong with the lady next door. She was about 45, but looked much older. She would sit up all night listening to Christian radio shows and talking loudly to someone. It got to the point where I couldn't sleep, so I went over to her place and asked her to keep it down. She opened the door, and I got a quick peek. Her walls all had crosses painted on them in different colors and words, like Jesus and angels scribbled everywhere. The windows were painted black, letting no light in at all. It was damp, yellow-stained 50 carpets, dog, and cockroaches everywhere. No dog, though. I asked her to please keep it down. She just looked at me and shut the door. Then she turned up the radio even louder. The next night, I had my girlfriend staying over. I wake up in the middle of the night and see a shadow of a person next to the bed, looking at us sleeping. I think I'm hallucinating, as I usually do in the dark when I'm sleepy. But then the shadow starts talking. It's my neighbor, and she's holding something in her hand. She broke in during the night, and who knows how long she stood there. "You should lock your doors at night," she says, and walks out. The next morning, I hear someone making strange noises below my bedroom window. It's my neighbor, talking to herself in tongues. She has a plastic bag in her hand with a rotting, dead dog inside. It's hot as hell outside, and I can smell death from that bag. At this point, I'm scared shitless. She's obviously very insane. I go upstairs and knock on another person's door and ask them, what the hell is going on? The guy is as scared as me, apparently. She broke into his apartment one evening as well, while he was watching TV with his kids. He got up from the couch to get a snack, only to find her behind the couch, staring at him, holding a power drill. Come to think about it, now I know what was in her hand at this stage. I'm basically myself. I call the cops, and they know all about her. Apparently, she's a violent schizophrenic, and she hasn't taken her meds. But they can't force her or enter her apartment without her permission because she owns it. The only thing they can do is get her when she goes outside. I sit up for the next 2 days, waiting for her to run out of cigarettes, when I hear her leave at 2 a.m. to go across the road to the 7-Eleven. I call the cops. They have 3 cars and a special van over in less than 2 minutes. They restrain her, throw her in the van, and drive off to some institution, and in less than a minute, it's like she was never there. I never see her again. Still have nightmares about her looking at me in my sleep for The payphone worked at a campground on night shift from 12 a.m. to 8 a.m. every night. It wasn't bad. I would bring in my PS2 and game a good portion of the night. only having to deal with 1 or 2 people on busy nights. It was just me, in this little 8x8 shack with nothing around but dark all night, my first week there. The other third shift guy who was quitting told me about this payphone a few feet from the shack where I worked. He said it rang every night at the same time just once. It was probably just an automated test call, he guessed. He'd never answered it himself. I worked there for a few months. It was the middle of the summer, so most nights I had the windows closed and couldn't hear the payphone go off by mid-August. I started leaving the windows open at night. Sure enough, every morning at the exact same time, the phone would ring once. The ring even sounded creepy, like the payphone had been submerged in water and then put back in place. One night, I got up the nerve to answer it. I set an alarm a few minutes before and went to wait at the phone until it rang. When it did, I answered it, but there was no sound. Just dead air, like someone was on the other line, but wasn't speaking. I said hello a few times and hung up. I did this every night for a week with the same results. I didn't think anything of it and left it alone for about a month. The first week of October, I decided to answer the phone once again. I set my alarm, and when the time came, I answered the phone. I repeatedly said hello into the receiver. Then I heard what sounded like someone inhaling through clenched teeth. The voice that followed was rough, like someone who had gargled gravel. It said my name, my full name, first, middle, and last. It was a voice I had never heard before. My throat tightened. I couldn't speak. I hung up, hands shaking. I rattled some change into the payphone and hit *69. The number had come from California. I lived in Indiana, 400. Darkness is always by your side. Can you hear the whispers lurking in the shadows? You're lucky for tonight, but in the next story, ... maybe it will be your turn. That's all from Mr.BlackDread for now. But remember, fear never truly ends. Did you lock the door? Are you sure? And that thing watching you? Are you certain it's outside? If you can sleep after hearing these stories, consider yourself lucky. But if something in the darkness is staring back at you, it's already too late now. Subscribe and like, because once you step into this world, there's no turning back. I am Mr.BlackDread, and tonight, the darkness calls for you. Story 1. My name is Jake, and I need to tell this story before it eats me alive. It's been 5 years, but I still wake up in a cold sweat, gasping for air, my heart hammering against my ribs. I still hear the whispers. I still see him. Back then, I had just graduated and was struggling to find a job. Money was tight, so I moved into a small, cheap apartment on the outskirts of town. The building was old paint peeling off the walls, water pipes groaning like they were alive, but it was quiet. Or at least, I thought it was. Everything seemed normal at first. I settled in, unpacked my things, and tried to adjust to my new life. But then, the whispers started. Every night, at exactly 3 a.m., I would wake up to a soft murmuring sound right outside my door. It wasn't loud, just barely audible, like someone was whispering secrets to the darkness. At first I thought it was a neighbor, maybe a night owl on the phone. But when I checked the peephole, the hallway was empty. This went on for several nights. I told myself it was my imagination, the old building playing tricks on me. But then, I saw the footprints. One night, after the whispers had faded, I decided to open the door. The hallway was as deserted as ever, but there, on the dusty floor, were footprints. Bare, wet, muddy footprints, leading right up to my door, and nowhere else. I froze. My mind raced with explanations. Maybe a maintenance worker, a prank. But deep down, I knew something was wrong. The next night, I stayed awake. I kept my eyes glued to the door, waiting. At 3 a.m., the whispers began again. But this time, they weren't outside. They were inside. A cold dread spread through my body. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. The air felt heavy, like the room itself was pressing down on me. Slowly, I turned my head toward the corner of the room. He was there, a man, tall, unmoving, his head slightly tilted. His skin was pale, almost gray, but it was his face that made my blood turn to ice. His eyes were missing, just empty, black sockets staring into nothing. His lips were slightly parted, whispering something in a voice that wasn't really a voice at all, more like a rustling, a dry hiss crawling into my ears. My body refused to move. My chest tightened. It felt like I was drowning in my own fear. The whispers grew louder. He wasn't moving, but I felt him getting closer. Then suddenly, the lights flickered on, and he was gone. I left that apartment the next morning, packed everything, and never looked back. But some nights, even now, I wake up at exactly 3 a.m., and when I do, I swear, I can still hear the whispers. Oh. Story 2. The only reason I'm telling this is because maybe he's still watching me. The apartment I moved into was tiny, old, damp, and cheap, but it fit my budget. Everything seemed normal at first, but after a few nights, I noticed something breathing. It was coming from the air vent in my ceiling. At first I thought it was just air flowing through the pipes, but after a few nights, I realized something unsettling. It belonged to a person, slow, raspy, and worst of all, deliberate. That night, I didn't sleep. As soon as the sun came up, I grabbed a chair, climbed up, and unscrewed the vent cover. A rush of cold, stale air hit my face. The inside was completely dark, but I could feel something shifting in there. I took a deep breath and leaned in, and I saw him at first. I thought it was just a shadow, but no. It wasn't a shadow. It was a face, but not a human face. The skin was shredded. His face was torn apart, like a corpse that had been scraped down to raw flesh. One of his cheeks was missing, exposing the inside of his jaw. But the worst part, there was a gaping hole where his nose should have been, and he was breathing through it. A wet, rattling, diseased breath. His mouth was slightly open, and because his lips were torn, his expression looked like an unfinished, broken smile. Then, he tilted his head, and he moved, without a sound, faster than I could react. I fell backward. The chair toppled over, and I hit the floor hard. My heart pounded in my chest. But when I looked up, the vent was empty. Only darkness. That night, I ran. I didn't even wait for morning. I left that cursed apartment without taking anything with me. I moved somewhere new, tried to forget, but some nights, I still hear the breathing, and when I glance at the shadows, I swear, I can see that torn, twisted smile watching me. Oh. Story 3. The only reason I'm telling this is because maybe that's why I'm still alive. I had just graduated from university and was looking for a cheap place to live. I found a small apartment in an old building in a quiet town. It wasn't much, but it was peaceful. The building manager was an old woman who was always kind to me. For the first few weeks, everything was fine, but then I started noticing something strange outside my door. Every night, at exactly 3:12 a.m., I heard a soft tapping sound. At first, I thought it was just the old pipes in the building, but then I realized something unsettling. It happened at the same time every night. A single tap, like someone was gently scraping the wood with their fingernail. One night, I finally gathered the courage to look through the peephole. There was no one there, but in the morning, I found a small piece of paper outside. My door. It had just 2 words written on it. Don't open. I thought it was a joke. Maybe someone in the building was trying to scare me. But that night, at the exact same time, the tapping came again. This time, there was something else outside my door. A single black strand of hair. Someone had left it there. But why? The next night, I sat by the door, holding a knife. When 3:12 a.m. arrived, the tapping returned. But this time, it wasn't just once. Again and again, tap, 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 like someone was waiting for me to open the door. I looked through the peephole, and I saw her. There was a woman standing outside my door, but something was wrong. Her posture was unnatural, like her bones had been broken and set incorrectly. Her head tilted to one side, her shoulders slumped unevenly. Worst of all, I couldn't see her face, because she was pressing it against the door right against the peephole. She was staring at me. I stumbled backward, but I didn't make a sound. Neither did she. Then I heard the whisper, a wet, scratchy voice from the other side of the door. Open the door. I didn't sleep that night. I sat there, frozen, until the sun came up. When I finally dared to check, she was gone. But right outside my door, on the floor, were several broken fingernails. The next morning, I left the apartment without looking back. I moved somewhere far away and tried to forget. But some nights, just as I start to drift into sleep, tap, 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 I hear it again, and sometimes, from behind the door. I swear, I can still hear that whisper. Open the door. Oh, the stories are over. But the night is just beginning. Did that shadow move? Did you really hear that sound? Or was it just your imagination? I am Mr.BlackDread, and we will meet again in the next story. If you're still here. And remember, everyone becomes a story someday, if you don't want yours to be told. The Forgotten Grove. Me name is Michael. The camping trip I had planned with my brother, Luke, and my old college friend Emily, was finally happening. We all wanted to escape the chaos of the city and spend a few days in nature. That weekend was supposed to be perfect. Our campsite was in a place untouched by civilization, no roads, no lights, completely isolated in a clearing deep in the forest. After driving as far as we could, we continued on foot. The towering trees nearly blocked out the sky, allowing only a few beams of light to filter through. The silence of the forest was comforting at first, but at the same time, it was too silent. We settled near a small stream. Luke immediately started a fire. I set up the tents, and Emily went for a short walk to explore the area. As night fell, we all sat around the campfire. Luke glanced away from the fire and turned to us. There's a grove nearby, he said. What is it? I asked. A forgotten place deep in the forest. A place with trees that have stood for hundreds of years. A place where people aren't supposed to go. At least, that's what the old stories say. Emily frowned. Another ridiculous legend. Luke shrugged. Who knows? We could check it out tomorrow. I couldn't explain the unease I felt in that moment. You know how sometimes in stories, people say they can feel something. It was like that. I knew we shouldn't go there, but at the same time, an unexplainable curiosity gnawed at me. As we retreated to our tents, the dim light of the fire flickered around us. I wanted to sleep, but I couldn't close my eyes. There was a strange tension in the forest. Then, I heard it. A low, almost melodic hum from outside. At first, I thought it was the wind, but there was no wind. Not a single leaf rustled. The humming sounded like a human voice, but it was too deep, too distorted to form any words. I slowly unzipped my tent. There was no movement from Luke's tent. He was probably asleep. Emily's tent was dark. Just as I was about to step outside, I felt something move near the trees at the edge of our campsite. Someone was there. I didn't see it, but I felt it. A pair of eyes watching us from the darkness. A chilling fear spread through me. I stood frozen for a few seconds, staring into the forest. Then, I quickly zipped up my tent and pretended to sleep. But all night, I listened to that humming sound. And just as I was about to drift off, the humming turned into a whisper. They found us. The next morning, no one spoke about the night before. It was as if we were all trying to act normal, pretending nothing had happened. But Emily's dark circles and Luke's uncharacteristic silence made it clear that none of us had slept well. Still, Luke insisted. "We have to find the grove," he said. "It's just a few hours' walk." I knew we shouldn't go, but somehow it felt like we had to. We started walking deeper into the forest. At first, everything was normal. Birds chirping, a light breeze, twigs snapping beneath our feet. But as we walked, the trees began to change. They grew denser, their trunks thicker. The leaves darkened from deep green to almost black. The wind died completely. The birds stopped singing. Then we found the clearing. But this clearing wasn't natural. The soil wasn't like normal forest soil. It was dry, cracked, and ashen gray, as if a massive fire had once burned here long ago. Just as I was about to suggest turning back, Emily noticed something. In the dirt, there were handprints, like human hands, but with much longer fingers. I took a step back. "We need to leave," I said, my voice shaking. Luke crouched down. "Some of the prints were fresh. Someone's been here," he murmured. And that's when we heard it again, the humming. But this time, it was closer. And then, a voice finally. The moment we heard it, we stumbled backward, in horror. But we didn't need to see whoever spoke, because we could feel their breath. Something was watching us from the trees. A shadow emerged behind the trees. Just a tall, unmoving figure. We couldn't see its eyes, but we knew it was looking straight at us, in a panic. Luke grabbed Emily's arm, and we all started running as we sprinted through the forest. I could hear footsteps behind us, but the footsteps weren't right. It was as if something was also walking on its hands. When we finally reached our campsite, there was nothing behind us, but that didn't mean it was gone. We jumped into the car and sped away. As we drove down the old dirt road, one last time, I saw it, just behind the trunk of a tree ahead, twisted upside down, watching us. After that day, we never set foot in the forest again, but sometimes, especially at night, when I pass by old woods, I hear that hum again, and every time, I understand the whisper more clearly. "We found you." The man in the woods' name is Jake, but they told me I should never talk about this story. Even my mom and dad want me to forget and move on, but how can I? Every time I think about that night, I can still feel his breath on my neck. It all started when my dad took me and my cousin Alex on a camping trip. The three of us were going to spend the weekend deep in the wilderness, far from the city, completely surrounded by nature. My dad knew how much I loved the outdoors, but back then, I had no idea how dark and terrifying the forest could be. The place we went to was beautiful. Tall trees covered the sky, letting only small rays of sunlight peek through the leaves. The lake in the middle of the forest was crystal clear, and Alex and I spent the afternoon skipping stones across the water. Everything felt normal until night fell. My dad set up the tents and lit the campfire. We sat around it, telling stories and roasting marshmallows. But at some point, I heard a noise coming from the bushes. "It's probably just a bird," my dad said, with a chuckle. But it wasn't a bird, because the sound was like footsteps. Alex must have heard it too, because his eyes widened, and he glanced at me. We didn't say anything. We didn't want to scare my dad. But deep inside, we both felt something was wrong, like someone was watching us. That night, we crawled into our tent. My dad slept in his own tent, while Alex and I shared another. I couldn't sleep. The sound of those footsteps outside wouldn't leave my mind. Maybe it was a bear, or something worse. Just as I was about to doze off, a shadow appeared outside the tent. Someone was standing there. I held my breath, forcing myself not to scream. Alex was completely still, his eyes wide with fear. Through the thin fabric of the tent, we could make out the shape of a tall man. He wasn't moving. He was just standing there. He stood there for so long that I almost convinced myself I was imagining things. But then, the zipper of our tent started to slowly slide down. I clenched my fists so tightly that my nails dug into my palms. Alex was shaking, covering his mouth with his hands. The zipper inched lower and lower. Then my dad's voice rang through the darkness. "Hey, who's there?" The figure vanished in an instant. My dad grabbed his flashlight and stepped outside. But he found no one. "It was just the wind," he muttered. "But the wind can't unzip a tent, can it?" In the morning, everything seemed normal. But then we noticed something in the dirt, right next to our tent. Huge footprints. They looked human, but they were far too large. Something was off. My dad seemed uneasy. "Maybe we should pack up and head home," he suggested. But Alex and I wanted to stay just one more night. That was the biggest mistake of our lives. That night, it got worse. While lying in the tent, I heard it again. The footsteps. But this time, they were closer. Then came the breathing, heavy, raspy breaths. And then, a whisper. "Are you awake?" I felt the blood drain from my face. I wanted to scream, but my voice was stuck in my throat. Someone was crouched right outside our tent, speaking to us then. A hand pressed against the fabric of the tent. The fingers were too long. No human hand could be that big. The thin fabric of the tent caved inward under its pressure. Then, slowly, it began dragging its nails across the tent's surface. Alex clamped his hand over his mouth, his eyes brimming with tears. From my dad's tent, there was no sound. That was the moment I realized we were alone. Then, we heard it moving. It wasn't just standing there anymore. It was circling our tent. The footsteps were heavy, yet terrifyingly fast. It moved from one side to the other in seconds. And then right behind the tent, that voice came again. "Are all of you awake?" That was it. We screamed and bolted out of the tent. My dad, startled awake, rushed outside as well. We all ran toward the fire, desperate for light. But there was no one there, only the dark forest surrounding us. My dad didn't hesitate. He packed everything in record time, and we sprinted to the car. As the headlights illuminated the trees, I saw it. Something moved between the trunks. A tall, impossibly thin man stood there, his head tilted to the side, watching us. My dad hit the gas, and we sped away. We never went back, but the story doesn't end there. Weeks later, I was lying in bed, finally starting to feel safe again. And then, I noticed something on my bedroom window, a massive, muddy handprint, and, in the silence of the night, I heard it again. "Are you awake? Is it over?" I don't know. But after that night, I can't sleep in the dark anymore. And to those who don't believe me, if you're brave enough, go there yourself. Maybe he's still waiting. The man in the woods, my name is Jake, but they told me I should never talk about this story. Even my mom and dad want me to forget and move on. But how can I? Every time I think about that night, I can still feel his breath on my neck. It all started when my dad took me and my cousin Alex on a camping trip. The three of us were going to spend the weekend deep in the wilderness, far from the city, completely surrounded by nature. My dad knew how much I loved the outdoors, but back then, I had no idea how dark and terrifying the forest could be. The place we went to was beautiful. Tall trees covered the sky, letting only small rays of sunlight peek through the leaves. The lake in the middle of the forest was crystal clear, and Alex and I spent the afternoon skipping stones across the water. Everything felt normal until night fell. My dad set up the tents and lit the campfire. We sat around it, telling stories and roasting marshmallows. But at some point, I heard a noise coming from the bushes. "It's probably just a bird," my dad said, with a chuckle. But it wasn't a bird, because the sound was like footsteps. Alex must have heard it too, because his eyes widened, and he glanced at me. We didn't say anything. We didn't want to scare my dad, but deep inside, We both felt something was wrong, like someone was watching us that night. We crawled into our tent. My dad slept in his own tent, while Alex and I shared another. I couldn't sleep. The sound of those footsteps outside wouldn't leave my mind. Maybe it was a bear, or something worse. Just as I was about to doze off, a shadow appeared outside the tent. Someone was standing there. I held my breath, forcing myself not to scream. Alex was completely still, his eyes wide with fear. Through the thin fabric of the tent, we could make out the shape of a tall man. He wasn't moving. He was just standing there. He stood there for so long that I almost convinced myself I was imagining things. But then, the zipper of our tent started to slowly slide down. I clenched my fists so tightly that my nails dug into my palms. Alex was shaking, covering his mouth with his hands. The zipper inched lower and lower. Then my dad's voice rang through the darkness. "Hey, who's there?" The figure vanished in an instant. My dad grabbed his flashlight and stepped outside, but he found no one. "It was just the wind," he muttered. "But the wind can't unzip a tent, can it?" In the morning, everything seemed normal. But then we noticed something in the dirt, right next to our tent. Huge footprints. They looked human, but they were far too large. Something was off. My dad seemed uneasy. "Maybe we should pack up and head home," he suggested. But Alex and I wanted to stay just one more night. That was the biggest mistake of our lives. That night, it got worse. While lying in the tent, I heard it again. The footsteps. But this time, they were closer. Then came the breathing, heavy, raspy breaths. And then, a whisper. "Are you awake?" I felt the blood drained from my face. I wanted to scream, but my voice was stuck in my throat. Someone was crouched right outside our tent, speaking to us. Then, a hand pressed against the fabric of the tent. The fingers were long, too long. No human hand could be that big. The thin fabric of the tent caved inward under its pressure. Then, slowly, it began dragging its nails across the tent's surface. Alex clamped his hand over his mouth, his eyes brimming with tears. From my dad's tent, there was no sound. That was the moment I realized we were alone. Then, we heard it moving. It wasn't just standing there anymore. It was circling our tent. The footsteps were heavy, yet terrifyingly fast. It moved from one side to the other in seconds. And then right behind the tent, that voice came again. "Are all of you awake?" That was it. We screamed and bolted out of the tent. My dad, startled awake, rushed outside as well. We all ran toward the fire, desperate for light. But there was no one there, only the dark forest surrounding us. My dad didn't hesitate. He packed everything in record time, and we sprinted to the car. As the headlights illuminated the trees, I saw it. Something moved between the trunks. A tall, impossibly thin man stood there, his head tilted to the side, watching us. My dad hit the gas, and we sped away. We never went back, but the story doesn't end there. Weeks later, I was lying in bed, finally starting to feel safe again, and then I noticed something on my bedroom window, a massive, muddy handprint. And, in the silence of the night, I heard it again. "Are you awake? Is it over? I don't know. But after that night, I can't sleep in the dark anymore. And to those who don't believe me, if you're brave enough, go there yourself. Maybe he's still waiting." Into the unknown, I thought I knew. The forest. The way the trees swayed with the wind, the sound of the leaves scraping against each other in the stillness. But tonight, everything was different. The darkness felt heavier, like it had a mind of its own, watching, waiting. My flashlight flickered, and I cursed under my breath, tightening my grip. It didn't matter. I had to keep moving. I had been hiking with a group of friends earlier that day. It was supposed to be a simple weekend getaway, a quick break from our chaotic lives. But something went wrong. Someone was missing. My closest friend, Ian, One moment he was laughing, the next, he was gone. We all searched for hours, but the more we called out, the more the forest swallowed our voices. I couldn't leave. I see OULDN single quotes. Now, walking through the trees alone, the air felt dense. It wasn't just the cold creeping under my skin, or the rustling of the branches. It was something deeper, something gnawing at me, pushing me forward when I wanted to turn back. The shadows in the woods seemed to shift, and I swore I saw eyes watching from the darkness. And then, I heard it. A whisper. It was faint at first, so soft that I wasn't sure if I was imagining it, but it was there, just beyond the reach of my flashlight, like a voice calling my name, not mine. Eons. The whisper repeated, growing louder. I froze. The forest seemed to hold its breath. My heart raced. The path ahead was blocked by a dense thicket, but there was something through it, something that pulled me closer. A house. An old, crumbling building I had never seen before. How had I missed it? The air around it was different, like it existed outside of time. Everything seemed to pause. I felt like I had stepped into a place where the rules of the world didn't apply. The door creaked open by itself. I didn't question. IT couldn't. Something told me this was the answer. I stepped inside, and the temperature dropped. My breath fogged in front of me, the darkness swallowing everything. The room was filled with dust and forgotten relics. Furniture, old and battered, lay scattered around the room. There was no sign of life, but then, there was movement. A figure in the corner, barely visible in the dim light. I blinked, and it was gone. My stomach twisted. "Hello?" I called, but my voice sounded small, swallowed by the space-silence. I turned to leave, but my foot caught on something, a small, dusty book. When I bent down to pick it up, I saw a note tucked inside. It was written in a hurried, uneven hand, the ink smudged. "Get out. Don't stay. They won't let you leave." I didn't know what to think. Panic clawed at my chest. I needed to go, but the door wouldn't open. It was like the house itself was holding me in, keeping me from leaving. I tried again, harder this time. Nothing. That's when I heard a soft sound of footsteps behind me. Slowly, deliberately, I spun around, heart pounding, and there he was. Ian. But not the Ian I remembered. His eyes were hollow, like he was a ghost, a shell of the person I once knew. His skin was pale, almost translucent, and his mouth barely moved. As he spoke, "You should have left when you had the chance." Before I could react, he vanished. I couldn't breathe. The walls seemed to close in on me. The air was thick, heavy with something I couldn't explain. I stumbled backward, falling onto a chair that seemed to materialize out of nowhere. Every time I thought I understood what was happening, everything changed. I looked around desperately. There was a window, but when I rushed to it, all I saw was more of the same endless blackness. I couldn't see anything outside. I was trapped. The whispers came again, but they weren't from Ian anymore. They were different, faint, like voices from another time, another world. They circled around me, getting closer, pressing in on my thoughts, my fears. I tried to scream, but nothing came out. The fear inside me turned to cold, heavy dread. The house was alive. It knew me. It knew my fears, and it was never going to let me leave. Every corner of the room held a shadow. Every creak of the floor seemed to echo with a past I couldn't escape. It was as if I had been pulled into a place where time didn't exist, a place where the rules of reality were bent and twisted. I tried to remember how I got here, but my mind wouldn't cooperate, and then I understood. The house wasn't just trapping, MIT was changing me. It was erasing who I was, bit by bit, until I was just another forgotten soul, lost in its walls. I glanced at the door again, but this time, it wasn't there. The walls were closing in, pushing me into a small, tight space. The whispers grew louder, filling my head, and then, everything went dark. The return of the night. The forest was shrouded in the darkness of night, wrapping everything in a heavy cloak of solitude. A cold wind whispered through the trees, rustling the leaves with a ghostly murmur. Rachel clutched her small flashlight tightly, the only source of light in the suffocating blackness. With each step, her feet sank into the damp earth, the strange scent of the soil filling her nose. She felt something was wrong, but she couldn't quite understand what. A few days ago, she had set out on an exploration deep into the woods with a group of friends. But when one of them disappeared, panic took over, scattering everyone in different directions. Yet, she refused to leave. She had to find the missing friend. The deeper she ventured, the more time seemed to lose its meaning, as if it, too, had been swallowed by the forest. After a while, her eyes caught movement between the trees. She spun around quickly. Nothing. A chill from the wind brushed against her skin, making her shudder. She took a deep breath, but she knew something was missing. Then, she heard it. A whisper, trembling and faint, barely audible. And then, from somewhere far away, a scream. But it was neither human nor animal. She quickened her steps. There was only one path left to take, leading to the abandoned apartment, the one that had stood there for as long as anyone could remember, yet belonged to no one. No one knew how long it had existed, or who had lived in it. But she knew she had to go there. She felt her friend was inside, that the voices were calling from within. This place, she thought, was a threshold between worlds. As she stepped into the apartment, hesitation gripped her. The door creaked open, heavy with time and silence. The weight of the place settled on her shoulders. Yet, the further she stepped inside, the more she felt drawn in, as if something unseen was pulling her forward. The air inside was as thick and strange as the forest outside. The room was cluttered, filled with forgotten remnants of lives long past. The old crumbling walls, the dust-covered furniture, they all seemed to whisper secrets she couldn't understand. And then, suddenly, he appeared. A man stood in the middle of the room. Slowly, deliberately, he stepped toward her, his gaze locked onto hers. His eyes deep, hollow voids sent a cold shiver down her spine. "Come here," he said. His voice echoed unnaturally, stretching and distorting in the stillness. Rachel's fear and curiosity tangled together in her mind, and then he vanished. He dissolved into the darkness, fading into nothing, like a shadow retreating into the walls. Rachel's breath hitched as realization dawned on her. This was the missing person. But now, he was something else. Something changed. She turned to run, but the sounds of the forest had disappeared. The silence was overwhelming, suffocating. Fear was no longer creeping at the edges of her thoughts. It had settled into the room, filling every corner with an eerie stillness. She was no longer in the depths of the forest. She was trapped within these four walls. There was only one window, but it led to nowhere. No matter how many times she tried to leave, the hallway always brought her back. The same door, the same room, the same suffocating emptiness. The lines of reality blurred, echoes of the past, whispers of the lost, and the murmurs of the forest all converged here. Each time she thought she had figured something out, another mystery took its place. But there was no solution, only this endless maze. And then, she understood. There was no escape, no way out. She was now one of the lost, another spirit, abandoned in the forest, now bound to this place. This apartment was a dead end, a trap, and each step only led her deeper into it. The same fear she had felt in the forest now pulsed in the walls, in the air, in every forgotten object surrounding her. And now, every time she closed her eyes, she found herself screaming. But this time, the scream was so deep, so vast, that understanding where she was, what she had become, was impossible. The Dark Circle. The entire town grew up with the stories of the abandoned village deep in the forest. No one could stay there for long. Anyone who ventured into the village would either disappear or return with such an empty, horrifying look in their eyes that no one dared approach them. A group of young people gathered the courage to debunk these old legends. The boldest among them was Jake, always seeking attention in the crowd. One evening, standing in the town square, he declared, "The legend is just a story. We'll spend a night in the forest and come back. No one's getting lost." Under Jake's leadership, the group set off into the dark forest late at night. The trees grew so closely together that even the thinnest beam of light couldn't penetrate to the ground. Only the faint glow of the moon filtered weakly through the branches. With each step, leaves rustled beneath their feet, and occasionally, the wind carried eerie whispers that sent chills down their spines. After walking for a while, the silhouette of an abandoned house emerged in the depths of the forest. But this house was unlike any other deserted place. Its windows were wide open, revealing its hollow interior, and the door seemed almost existent. Jake pointed ahead. "This is it," he said. "This is where it all began." The house was truly strange. Faded writings covered the walls, some in Latin, others in cryptic symbols that no one could decipher. But the most unsettling thing was a perfectly round circle in the center of the floor. The lines were so clear, so precise, as if they had been drawn not 100 years ago, but just an hour earlier. They looked around, but there was nothing unusual. As the night deepened, the group found themselves gathered around the circle when they suddenly heard a sound. At first, it was faint, then it grew louder, a laughter. But this was no ordinary laughter. It wasn't human. It was the laughter of something rotted and broken. Panic gripped them. They tried to step back, but their feet felt glued to the floor. Then, all at once, a wave of freezing air burst through the room, and from within the circle, something unseen began to rise. A shadowy figure, barely distinguishable in the pitch-black darkness, was watching them. Fear overtook them. They turned to run, but it was as if they were trapped in a nightmare. Their bodies moved, yet they remained in the same spot. For a moment, silence fell. Then, Jake took a step forward into the circle. A voice echoed, "If you take one more step, no matter how far you run, you will never leave. This place will be your home now." Suddenly, everything shifted. The ground warped, the walls vanished, and a blinding white light swallowed the room. They collapsed to the floor, gasping for breath. The circle was no longer just a marking. It had become a trap beyond time and space. Then, Jake's voice rang out, "Listen to me. To escape, we must." A blood-curdling scream cut him off. Jake's eyes went hollow, just like those who had disappeared before. But this time, Jake wasn't there anymore. Only his eyes remained, staring into nothingness, locked forever in the dark corners of the house. And worst of all, Jake's voice echoed back through the emptiness, "You will all stay here, forever." The group awoke suddenly. The circle was gone. Behind them, there was nothing, only an empty forest. But in their eyes, in the depths of their souls, the terror remained. Nothing was truly gone. Deep within the forest, the circle still existed, waiting. If someone ever dared to return and look again, perhaps the circle would be waiting for them too. Travelers of Darkness, Day 1. The beginning of the road, first light of dawn, cast a pale gray hue across the sky. Inside the car, I could hear the soft hum of the engine. James, sitting behind the wheel, had his eyes fixed on the road, lost in deep silence. Beside him, in the passenger seat, Emily just wanted to get to school as soon as possible, like every morning. But today, there was a strange uneasiness inside me. James tightened his grip on the steering wheel, then glanced sideways at me. "I had a weird dream last night," he muttered. "It felt like someone was calling me, but the voice didn't sound human." I rolled my eyes. "Don't put too much meaning into dreams, James," I said. But the unease inside me only deepened. As we moved farther from the city center, the roads became more desolate. The trees surrounding us looked more ominous under the morning mist. A few cars passed by now and then, but one of them, a black SUV, had been behind us for a while. James glanced at the mirror, his expression darkening. "How long has that car been following us?" he whispered. I turned to look. The vehicle, with its completely blacked out windows, was moving at a steady pace behind us. "Maybe it's just a coincidence," I said, but my voice wavered. Just then, the SUV sped up and pulled up alongside us. No one was visible inside. The windows were like an abyss. Suddenly, it stopped in the middle of the road, forcing James to slam on the brakes. The car skidded, my heart nearly leaping out of my chest. No one got out of the SUV. Its headlights flickered. A deep fear settled in my bones. "Step on it, James. Let's get out of here." James pressed the gas pedal, and the car surged forward. But as I glanced in the mirror, my blood ran cold. The black SUV was following us again without making a sound. It was floating, gliding as if defying the laws of physics, and in that moment, I realized there was no human behind us. Day 2. Silence. At school. Next morning at school, my thoughts were still tangled in what had happened. James tried to act indifferent, but I could see it in his eyes. The fear had gripped both of us. Focusing in class was impossible. I could feel something watching us during lunch. James took out his phone and showed me something. "Someone texted me last night," he said, his voice uneasy. "But there's no number." I looked at the screen. The message contained only 3 words: "Do not return. You will die." The fear burrowed deep into my bones. Day 3. The nightmare begins. Night, I dreamt of a road. A pitch black, empty road. I was walking, but my legs wouldn't move. A whisper echoed behind me. Come closer." A hand touched my shoulder. I woke up screaming. My phone rang. It was James. "Emily. That car was here again last night," he said, his voice shaking. "I don't think this thing will ever leave us alone." We knew now. The black SUV was a curse. And it wasn't going to stop. Day 4. The call of death that morning. James didn't come to pick me up. I couldn't reach his phone. A terrible feeling settled in my stomach as I made my way to school alone. When I arrived, everything was eerily quiet. The hallways were empty. As I entered the classroom, James's seat was vacant. Panic gripped me. Just then my phone vibrated. A message from James. "The car is here. It's calling me. I can't run. I'm sorry." Right after, my phone screen went black, and then I heard James's voice. "I'm leaving, Emily." The voice didn't come from the phone's speaker, it came from inside the classroom. Slowly, I turned around. James stood at the back of the room. But something was wrong. His eyes were empty, as if his soul had been drained from his body. He was wearing the same clothes from yesterday, but they were stained with blood. Tears welled up in my eyes. "James." His smile reeked of death. "It took me, Emily," he whispered. "Now it's your turn." The lights suddenly went out, and from the darkness, the sound of an engine rumbled. The black SUV was waiting in the schoolyard. The dream of the night asterisk in the middle of the night. Demi's phone screen suddenly lit up. The clock showed 3 o'clock. In a dark room, after hours passing unnoticed, he had woken up to the sound of a call. The person on the other end of the line was a villager he knew, but wasn't particularly close to. "Demi, there's a huge problem," the villager said, his voice trembling. "My animals, they are acting very strangely. Their bellowing won't stop, as if something has driven them mad. Something is wrong. Please, come here." Demi rubbed his eyes. After a sleepless day, this sudden call, forcing him into action, left a void inside him. But, as a professional veterinarian, he had a duty to fulfill. Without thinking about the time, he quickly got dressed. An inner instinct told him something was wrong, and he had to go. Before long, he was driving down the dark road. At that moment, everything had taken an unexpectedly eerie turn. The car's headlights illuminated the path ahead, while everything else was swallowed by pitch-black darkness. The trees lining both sides of the road swayed with the wind, as if they were alive. There was a nagging feeling that something was missing as he drove along. Demi's eyes kept catching glimpses of movement in the darkness, small, indistinct silhouettes, but whenever he focused on them, there was nothing there. Still, in this darkness, where right and wrong blurred together, he decided not to dwell on the figures lurking at the edge of his vision. However, as he continued down the road, an unsettling chill crept over him. Something was off, but what? The forest around him seemed to grow darker. The trees seemed to draw closer together, as if an unseen force was trying to trap him. In that moment, something inside Demi snapped. This road no longer felt normal. An alarm rang in his mind. As he turned a corner, the village lights came into view. He widened his eyes and pressed forward, but seeing the lights up close only deepened his sense of unease. Everything kept shifting, as if he were stepping into a dream. The uncertainty clouding Demi's mind pushed him forward, deeper into the village streets. As he approached the village entrance, Demi stepped out of his car, but this time, something was different. Everything felt eerie and empty. The sounds of animals filled the air, yet not a single human was in sight. Where were the villagers? What had happened? Only the midnight cries of the animals and the unseen eyes watching him remained. The animals stood with puffed-out chests, swollen bellies, their frantic bellowing never ceasing. They were maddened, lost in a frenzy. For a moment, Demi was lost in the atmosphere. Animals surrounded him, but there were no people. He took a few steps, and everything around him seemed to fade away. Suddenly, he found himself inside a barn, cloaked in darkness. The animals charged toward him, yet they hesitated. They wanted to advance, but each one of them recoiled at the last moment. There was a strange fear and overwhelming terror clashing with their rage. As a veterinarian, Demi tried to approach the animals with all his knowledge and experience, but everything was wrong. The creatures around him were shifting into shadows, blending into one another. Their chests expanded unnaturally, their fur bristling. The fear in their eyes was so intense that, for a moment, Demi felt like a stranger even to himself. Something had broken somehow. The spirits of these animals had been lost. Then, something moved outside. The shadows vanished, the animals froze, and an eerie silence fell. But the silence carried a sense of waiting. In this dreamlike world, Demi realized that everything had faded away, leaving only the lost animals and an unseen force lingering in the darkness. Half consumed by fear, half entranced by this strange power, he felt himself being pulled deeper into it. Suddenly, everything turned black. The bellow of an animal, a distant scream, but none of it was real. And then, as if a dream had been erased, everything vanished. When Demi opened his eyes, he remembered nothing. The village, the night, the animals, it had all disappeared. He found himself in his room. It was only the early hours of the morning. He couldn't recall the terrifying night, yet there was an unshakable emptiness inside him. Something was missing. Something had been lost. Forgetting that dream was impossible. At that moment, he realized that the minutes he had spent in that village had been etched deep into his soul, as if they had become a part of his very existence. A single question echoed in Demi's mind. Had he truly woken up, or was he still trapped in a nightmare? The darkness at the end of the road night had fallen, and only a few stars shimmered above me. I was walking alone along the highway, my car's headlights barely illuminating a few steps ahead on the dark road. A strange unease crept over me. At that moment, I had no idea I was about to experience the most terrifying moments of my life. Suddenly, my car stalled. The engine shuddered before falling silent, and I realized the gear shift was stuck. I was alone, with not a single soul in sight. Stranded in the middle of the highway, I pounded on the hood in frustration, but nothing changed. I waited for a while, but then a glimmer of hope appeared. A single car sped past me, but soon came to a stop and reversed toward me. A woman stepped out. Her car had broken down too. Her name was Lily. As Lily approached, I noticed the fear in her eyes growing with every step. She felt like a lost soul. Something was off, but I couldn't quite grasp what it was. I decided to help her. But despite her calm demeanor, something about her was unsettling. Lily's gaze felt like a void, pulling me in, making me lose track of time. I let her into my car, and we drove off. She was eerily silent. Only the soft hum of the engine and the howling wind outside filled the air. Lily barely spoke. No matter how far we drove, we couldn't seem to find the right road. Every turn led me deeper into darkness. The highway felt like some kind of passage, an endless loop with no way back and no destination ahead. After what felt like an eternity, we finally reached my neighborhood. Just a few streets remained. Then, Lily turned to me and asked, "Can I stay with you tonight?" A strange feeling settled over me. Should I help her, or had something already gone terribly wrong? I agreed. As the night wore on, I noticed the strange expression on Lily's face growing darker. When I finally laid down in my bed, I made space for her beside me. But with every passing minute, the atmosphere became more unsettling. I simply watched her, my mind racing with thoughts. She was trying to tell me something, but what? The air in the room felt heavy, shifting in an unexplainable way. It was as if something unseen was watching me. Then, in the midst of my sleeplessness, I opened my eyes. Lily was gone. The bed beside me was empty. That moment, realizing she had vanished, was the most terrifying of the night. But the truth was even worse. She had never left. I closed my eyes again, and suddenly, I felt it. A cold touch. She was so close I could feel her breath controlling mine. Slowly, a shadow appeared at the foot of my bed. A dreadful sensation crept inside me, like something seeping into my very soul. She was no longer just a woman. She had become an entity, an abyss within me. At that moment, I knew I was powerless. I was already lost in fear. Every time I tried to sleep, Lily's smile dragged me into a suffocating void. The walls of my bedroom pulsed as if time itself had frozen. I could feel her presence in every inch of the room, trapping me inside a nightmare that would never end. And then, I woke up once more. Lily's eyes locked onto mine. Something stirred within them, emptiness and sorrow intertwined. She was never meant to belong to this world. She had come from somewhere else, and now she was pulling me with her, turning me into another lost soul. As I lay in bed, paralyzed, I realized the horror had only begun. Lily's presence had consumed my home, every room, every shadow. I was no longer just a man in my own house. I was a ghost, and all Lily ever wanted was for me to disappear into the darkness forever. The forsaken ward clock struck midnight as Dr. Nathan Holloway made his way down the dimly lit corridor of Blackwood Asylum. The hospital had long been rumored to be haunted, but Nathan never paid attention to such superstitions. He was a man of science, bound by reason. Yet, something about tonight felt ... different. The power flickered briefly, and a deep chill settled in the air. Nathan ignored it and continued his rounds. As he passed room 306, a soft knocking came from inside. His heart skipped a beat. That room had been sealed for decades after a patient had vanished without a trace. Slowly, he reached for the doorknob. To his surprise, it turned easily. The door creaked open, revealing a pitch-black room. The only sound was his own breathing, shallow and uneven. Then, a whisper, "Help me, ... Nathan swung his flashlight toward the corner, illuminating a frail figure hunched over. It was a man, pale, gaunt, and dressed in tattered hospital garments. His hollow eyes locked onto Nathan's. "They're coming," the man wheezed, before dissolving into mist. Nathan stumbled backward, his rational mind struggling to comprehend what he had just seen. The whispers grew louder, overlapping voices chanting in a guttural language. The walls seemed to twist, morphing into something unnatural. Then the floor beneath him collapsed. He fell through darkness, his screams swallowed by the abyss. When he landed, the scent of damp earth filled his nostrils. He was no longer in the hospital. He was in a forest. Towering trees loomed around him, their gnarled branches like skeletal hands reaching for the sky. The whispers hadn't stopped. They slithered through the trees, growing closer. Nathan scrambled to his feet and ran. The ground beneath him was soft, almost breathing. Shadows darted between the trees, figures too fast to see clearly. His breath came in ragged gasps as he pushed forward, hoping for a way out. Ahead, a clearing, a glimmer of hope. But as he reached it, his heart plummeted. In the center of the clearing stood the hospital. It was impossibly out of place, its rotting facade and shattered windows giving it the appearance of an ancient relic. The whispers urged him forward, but his instincts screamed at him to run the other way. Then he saw them. Figures emerged from the trees, faceless, cloaked in shadows, their elongated fingers stretching toward him. One stepped forward, its voice a perfect mimic of the vanished man from room 306. "You never left." Nathan turned to flee, but the forest was gone. The walls of Blackwood Asylum surrounded him once more, yet something was terribly wrong. The air was thick, suffocating. The whispers had become screams. He looked down, his reflection stared back at him from the polished floor, but it wasn't his own. It was the gaunt, hollow-eyed man from room 36, and then, darkness. The vanishing ward. Stephen wiped the sweat from his forehead as he finished his third cup of coffee. The fluorescent lights of St. Augustine Hospital flickered above him, casting eerie shadows on the pale green walls. It was just past midnight, and the graveyard shift was as dull as always. The silence was unsettling, broken only by the occasional beep of a heart monitor or the distant echo of footsteps in the hallway. "Something's wrong with room 206, Claire," one of the night nurses said as she approached him. Her face was pale, her fingers gripping the tablet tightly. Stephen frowned. 206. That wing has been closed for years. "What do you mean something's wrong?" Claire hesitated. "We've been getting vitals from there, a pulse, oxygen levels, like there's someone inside. But there's no record of a patient, and ... I swear I heard breathing when I walked by." Chill ran down Stephen's spine. He had heard rumors about the abandoned wing. Staff members whispered about strange occurrences, doors locking on their own, ghostly figures seen through the frosted windows, and whispers in the dark. But he had always brushed them off as hospital folklore. "Let's check it out," he said, grabbing his flashlight. The hallway leading to room 206 was unnervingly quiet. The air felt thick, heavy with something unspoken. As Stephen pushed open the door, a wave of cold air rushed past him. The room was dark, except for the blinking green light of a heart monitor. His stomach twisted. The bed was occupied. A man lay motionless, his face obscured by the shadows. Stephen took a cautious step forward. "Sir, are you all right?" The figure slowly turned its head towards him. The movement was unnatural, like bones grinding together. The dim glow of the monitor illuminated hollow, sunken eyes and lips curled into a grotesque smile. "You're too late," the man whispered. The heart monitor flatlined. The room plunged into darkness. Then, the screaming began. Stephen staggered backward, as an unseen force shoved him out of the room. The door slammed shut behind him, the lock clicking into place. From inside, the horrific screams grew louder, warping into a chorus of agonized voices. He turned to Claire, but she was gone, Panic surged through him. He sprinted down the hall, his breath ragged. The hospital had changed. The sterile white walls were now cracked, covered in deep gashes, as if something had clawed through them. The overhead lights flickered erratically, revealing shadowy figures standing motionless at the far end of the corridor. A deafening shriek rang out, and suddenly, the figures lunged forward. Stephen ran. He burst through the emergency exit, expecting to step into the hospital parking lot. Instead, he found himself in a dense forest. The transition was instant, seamless, as if the hospital had never existed. The air smelled of damp earth and decaying leaves. Moonlight filtered through the towering trees, casting long, twisting shadows. He turned, but the hospital was gone. No, 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 he muttered, spinning in circles. The only sound was his own. Frantic breathing. A branch snapped. Stephen froze. Something moved between the trees. Whispers slithered through the air, incomprehensible and malevolent. Shapes emerged from the darkness, figures with elongated limbs and hollow eyes. Their mouths stretched wide in silent screams. A low, guttural voice spoke from behind him. "You brought them here. Now they will never leave." Stephen turned slowly, his heart hammering against his ribs. Standing before him was the man from room 206, his skeletal frame barely concealed by the hospital gown. His grin widened, revealing rows of jagged, needle-like teeth. "Run," the man whispered. Stephen did. The forest was endless. No matter how far he ran, the trees seemed to shift, twisting to keep him trapped within their labyrinth. The figures moved closer, their fingers brushing against his skin, their whispers turning to screams. Then, the ground gave way. He plummeted into darkness. Stephen woke up to the sound of a heart monitor beeping steadily. His eyes fluttered open to the familiar sight of the hospital ceiling. His chest ached, his limbs felt heavy. A nurse leaned over him, smiling. "You had quite the fall, Mr. Carter. You've been out for hours. We found you unconscious in the woods, outside the hospital. How did you even get there?" Stephen's mouth was dry. His memory swirled like a nightmare, disjointed and terrifying. "Claire," he croaked. The nurse's smile faltered. "Who?" Stephen's blood ran cold. "There's no one here by that name." Outside the window, the tree line loomed, dark and unyielding, and from the shadows, something watched. Night shift. Stephen rubbed his eyes, startled by the shrill alarm echoing inside his head. The emergency room at the old hospital where he worked the night shift had become unexpectedly busy that night, but the strangest part was the calls coming from room 303 and the unidentified patient record that had appeared in the hospital system. The head nurse, Claire, approached him with a tablet in her hand. "This patient isn't in the records, Stephen, but the room shows as occupied," she said, her voice trembling. Stephen suppressed his unease, nodded, and made his way toward the old corridor where room 303 was located. That part of the hospital was nearly abandoned. The fluorescent lights flickered, casting brief moments of darkness, and heavy breathing sounds echoed from within. He slightly pushed the door open. A shadow shifted on the bed inside. A pale, frail man fixed his gaze on Stephen. "You found me, but it's too late," the man whispered. Stephen tried to step back, but an invisible force behind the door pulled him inside. The door slammed shut. He was alone. The man's eyes glowed like empty voids. "They are coming," he murmured. A hand touched his shoulder from behind. It was Claire. But suddenly, her face changed. Her eyes were gouged out, her mouth stretched open, and a deafening scream erupted from within. Stephen screamed and threw himself against the door, forcing his way back into the corridor. The whispers and the sound of predatory footsteps chased him. He sprinted down the corridor, aiming for the hospital's exit. But as he stepped outside, the hospital courtyard was gone. Instead, he found himself in the middle of an endless forest. Dry branches cracked under his feet, shadows shifted in the dark. he gasped for breath. Turning back, he expected to see the hospital, but it was no longer there. A deep laughter echoed. "You're one of us now, ... Stephen opened his mouth to scream, but long gaunt figures emerged from the forest, moving toward him. There was nowhere to run. A nightmare that had begun in a hospital was now ending in the depths of a dark forest. Shivering, Stephen took a step back. As the figures approached, indecipherable whispers filled his ears. "You don't belong here, but you can never leave now. ... A dry branch snapped beneath his foot, and all the figures suddenly froze. Stephen stood still. For a brief moment, he thought he saw a glimmer of hope, but then, the shadows lunged at him. A hand gripped his throat and threw him hard onto the ground. The soil beneath him felt damp, but strangely warm, almost as if he had fallen onto something alive. Stephen opened his eyes and saw the trees bending toward him. The sky above was an empty void, devoid of stars. A tall, skeletal figure emerged from the shadows, its hollow, glowing eyes fixed on him. "You will be fun to play with," it said in a low, chilling voice. Stephen tried to run, but his legs wouldn't move. As the entity came closer, the shadows around him began shifting, morphing into screaming faces. "There is only one way out of here, ... the figure said, extending its hand. Stephen took a deep breath, but instead of air, thick smoke filled his lungs. He had no idea how long he had been in the forest, but he knew one thing for certain: nothing would ever be the same again. The haunted school. My name is Nathan. Crestwood High School, long believed to have been abandoned and known as the dwelling of dark legends and forgotten sorrows, had stood alone on the outskirts of town, amidst swirling mists. Even the first time I heard its name, it evoked both fear and curiosity in every whispered tale. No one ever spoke of the tragic stories that were said to be murmured from behind its windows. Yet I burned with the desire to uncover the truth hidden behind that myth. As I approached the school, its broad rusted iron doors, cracked walls, and the cold light filtering through shattered glass immediately drew me in. Once a building filled with the echoes of bustling corridors, it now stood as a silent guardian of quiet despair and melancholy memories. With each careful step I took, the creaking of the old wooden floors seemed to whisper the painful recollections of the past into my ears. The moment I stepped inside, a sudden cold gust of wind hit my face, and I felt an unsettling stillness drift through the halls. As I moved along the corridors, the faded portraits hanging on the walls reminders of students and teachers, whose faces bore the marks of life and loss seemed to be silently trying to tell me the sorrowful history of the building. After a short while, I reached the old library. Dusty shelves, worn-out books, and the pale light seeping through broken windows revealed that this place had once been full of knowledge and life, but was now ensnared by abandonment and oblivion. Driven by deep curiosity, I began to rummage through the shelves, until I discovered an old diary. Its pages were slightly yellowed and nearly illegible, yet within its lines lay clues to the tragic events that had once taken place in this very school. As I started reading the diary, I encountered words that echoed like the old whispers on the walls. "This school is the rubble of our hopes and dreams. Darkness has seeped into every corner, and we have become trapped here with our lost souls." Those words awakened in me a profound sorrow and a shattering sense of fear. I felt as though the writer of the diary was one with the very spirit of the school. In that moment, I understood that the tragedy that had unfolded here years ago had not only scarred the physical structure, but had also left indelible marks on the hearts of those who once dwelled within. As I continued along the corridors, I noticed faded writings and symbols on the walls. In one corner, I found an old photograph with Evelyn scrawled in delicate handwriting. In the picture, a young, hopeful girl smiled, yet the sorrow in her eyes hinted at a dark story left behind. That name appeared several times in the diary. In that instant, I wondered if Evelyn might have been at the center of the school's tragedy, perhaps the most innocent victim of the events that transpired here. Days passed as I wandered through the halls of Crestwood High, occasionally startled by a sudden whisper, a door that creaked open slightly, or the distant sound of an old bell. Each sound evoked the lost cries of the past, drawing me deeper into that bygone era. At night, as I sat silently within the school, contemplating those moments, my heart grew heavy and my soul was gripped by a restless wakefulness. One evening, summoning all my courage, I decided to venture into the deepest, most forsaken part of the school. As I descended narrow, dark staircases, the echo of my footsteps felt as though I were being watched by 1,000 unseen eyes. Finally, I reached the old laboratory, a place bearing the remnants of past experiments and desperate searches. Here, broken glass test tubes, rusty instruments, and forgotten notebooks stood as mute witnesses. On the walls, alongside scientific scribbles, there were eerie inscriptions about death and immortality. These notes seemed to symbolize the dark forces behind the school's tragedy and the inescapable grip of mortality. In the far corner of the laboratory, I discovered an old table half buried in the dust. On it lay a letter, written with trembling hands. "We left our hopes and dreams here. This school is not just a building. It is the eternal shrine of our sorrows, our losses, and our silent cries. Every night, our walls whisper, listen to our forgotten souls." As I read the letter, it felt as if the cumulative pain of the past descended upon me all at once. Evelyn's name appeared in the letter, and in that moment, I realized that this school had not been built to make us forget its tragedy, but rather to remind us of the wounds that remain hidden in our hearts. My emotions mingled into a complex blend of fear, curiosity, and profound sorrow. Before leaving, I turned back for one final look. In the empty classrooms, among the dusty traces on the blackboard, between old notebooks and broken chairs, I could hear the echoes of what had once been a testament to lost innocence and painful farewells. Crestwood High was no longer just the forgotten tunnel. My name is Sebastian. When I first set foot in the town of Knoxford, I felt that there was a secret hidden deep beneath its surface, something far more profound than what met the eye. As I wandered through the town's narrow, cobblestone streets, the ancient engravings carved into the walls seemed to whisper the sorrowful history of these lands. Yet, what captivated me most was the legend of the Forgotten Tunnel, a tale that spoke of a mysterious passage hidden beneath the town. Centuries ago, Knoxford had thrived on a prosperous mining operation. However, deep within the mine lay a labyrinthine tunnel where miners had mysteriously vanished, never to return. The locals called this passage the Forgotten Tunnel, believing it to echo the lost souls, unspoken sorrows, and forsaken hopes of those who disappeared within its depths. One night, driven by an insatiable curiosity and an irresistible pull toward the unknown, I found myself drawn to this tunnel. As the moon cast its pale light through dark, rolling clouds, I paused before an abandoned miner's hut. The weathered walls of the hut seemed to carry the hopes and heartaches of those who had once toiled within its confines. Stepping inside, the dusty floor and rusted iron doors reminded me of the relentless march of time. In the darkest corner of the hut, I discovered an almost forgotten stone lid embedded in the floor. This lid concealed the secret entrance to the tunnel. With trembling hands, I pried it open and began my descent along a narrow stone staircase. With every step downward, the cold, damp air of the underground wrapped around me, as if whispering long-forgotten tales from the past. My weak flashlight could only outline the silhouette of the path a few meters ahead, at the end of the stairs. My eyes were drawn to ancient symbols and carvings etched into the walls. These marks bore witness to the tragic events and desperate struggles of the miners, who seemed to have carved their very lives into the stone. For a long while, silence reigned. Only the sound of my own breathing and the pounding of my heart filled the space. But as I ventured further, I began to hear soft whispers emanating from the tunnel's depths. Initially, I mistook these sounds for the wind's murmur, yet they soon revealed themselves as the sorrowful laments of thousands of lost souls. Reaching the widest part of the tunnel, I noticed a worn board hanging on one of the walls. Scrawled in the handwriting of an old miner was a brief note. "My name is Jonathan. Here lie the traces of our lost hopes and the sorrows that vanished into darkness. The forgotten tunnel holds not only our bodies, but also the cries of our souls." The words on that note carried the weight of centuries. In that moment, with each step I took, I could feel the pain and hope of countless lives lost in the depths of the mine. The engravings on the walls told the tragic stories of people who once brimmed with life, but were ultimately swallowed by misfortune. Every mark served as a stark reminder of how fragile and transient life truly is, and how the imprints of the past remain here, as if deliberately left to be remembered. As I delved deeper, the atmosphere of the tunnel grew increasingly oppressive and suffocating. The cold air merged with the echoing whispers off the stone walls, as if every rock harbored an ancient secret. For a moment, I felt lost in the interplay of my own fear and curiosity amid the tunnel's silence. The voices seemed to murmur, "Do not forget us." It was a call both eerie and mesmerizing. Finally, at the end of a narrow corridor, I encountered a small iron door. The cold, ominous silence that emanated from behind it conveyed the sense that unresolved destinies and forgotten lives were hidden beyond. In that critical moment, when fear and curiosity intertwined, mustered the last of my courage and pushed the door open as it swung ajar. I stepped into a vast chamber, reminiscent of the ruins of the old mine. This room held every trace of the past. It was a silent witness to forsaken hopes and lost dreams. When I emerged from the tunnel, the time I had spent within its depths felt as if it belonged to a shadowed dream. The quiet of Knoxford's night still echoed in my ears, yet I left with a newfound understanding and a profound, inward sorrow. But the experience did not end there. In the days that followed, the memories of that night clung to me like a persistent fog. I found myself haunted by visions of ghostly miners and the echoing lament of their voices. Their silent stories urged me to return, to delve even deeper into the enigma that had so thoroughly consumed my thoughts. Driven by this lingering call, I returned to the tunnel several times. Each visit revealed new mysteries, subtle changes in the carvings on the walls, faint traces of footsteps where none should be, and, most startling of all, the soft glimmer of light that seemed to pulse in rhythm. Whispers in the town cemetery. My name is Victor. The old cemetery of Ebenvale had been a whispered legend in my mind since childhood. The townspeople believed that the silent, murmuring sounds emanating from the cemetery at night were the cries of the dead. These rumors were both chilling and sorrowful, echoing the painful stories of the past. One night, I realized that my curiosity and unresolved questions had drawn me to this mysterious place. As the moon spread its pale light across the sky, a thin mist enveloped the cemetery. Despite the fear stirring within me, a longing for the unknown compelled me to step closer into the graveyard. With every footstep, I felt as though the faded carvings and worn inscriptions on the ancient stones were whispering long-forgotten stories to me. When I reached the gate of the cemetery, amid the howling wind and the rustle of the trees, it seemed as if forgotten voices from ages past were calling out, "Do not forget us." These words awakened in me a deep sorrow and an indescribable curiosity. Though I wanted to retreat, my soul could not resist that enigmatic summons. Slowly, I approached an ancient tombstone. On it, a date and a name were inscribed in letters, weathered by time. Yet what truly caught my eye was a diary-like remnant lying half-finished on the ground beside it. In that moment, this relic harboring the final words of the departed and the memories lost in the dusty pages of me, As I gently turned its pages with trembling fingertips, I saw traces of sorrow, loss, and forgotten hope in every line. On one page, carefully penned sentences read, "Every tear is a reflection of a forgotten love and a lost hope. Here, we have become lost in silence. Our whispers echo so that you may never forget the deep wounds of the past." Those words resonated within me. It was as if a silent cry from the depths of the cemetery reminded me of life's fragility, and how the remnants of the past still dwell on this land. In my heart, I felt the quiet murmurs of the dead. Driven by an inexplicable impulse, I ventured deeper into the heart of the cemetery. The narrow winding paths led me to an ancient mausoleum, its heavy stone walls adorned with intricate carvings that seemed to tell stories of love, loss, and legacy. As I traced my fingers along the cold surface, I felt a connection to the souls who once found solace within these walls, a connection that was both haunting and profoundly moving. Inside the mausoleum, the atmosphere grew even more oppressive. Faded murals and broken sculptures hinted at rituals long abandoned, their silent narratives merging with the ambient sound of the rustling leaves outside. I paused for a long moment, allowing the weight of centuries to seep into my bones. Every detail, the chipped marble, the delicate tracery of ironwork, spoke of a past steeped in both reverence and despair. As the night deepened, a gentle, sorrowful melody began to weave itself through the cold air, a melody that seemed to arise from the very earth beneath my feet. The tune was delicate, yet carried the full burden of lost years and unspoken regrets. I closed my eyes and let the music envelop me, each note stirring memories I had never lived but somehow understood. In that timeless moment, I sensed that the cemetery was not merely a repository of the dead, but a living archive of human emotion, where every sigh of the wind echoed the laughter, the tears, and the dreams of those who had passed. Wandering back along the winding paths, I noticed that the inscriptions on the tombstones had become clearer, as if illuminated by the ethereal glow of the moon. Names, dates, and epitaphs that once faded into obscurity now shone with a poignant clarity, each one a silent testament to lives that had once burned brightly. I felt compelled to honor these stories, to remember that even in death, each soul had a tale that deserved to be told. As dawn approached, the mist began to lift, revealing the cemetery in a new light. I stepped out of that hallowed ground with a heavy yet enlightened heart. The experience had imprinted on me a profound truth. The past, with all its sorrow and beauty, remains ever present. The cemetery was more than a final resting place. It was a mirror reflecting the delicate balance between loss and hope, a reminder that every ending births the seeds of new beginnings. Even as I left, the soft echo of that haunting melody lingered in my ears, a promise that the whispers of the past would forever guide those willing to listen. I walked away with a deep awareness of life's transient nature, carrying the legacy of those forgotten voices and a quiet determination to remember, always. The Forest of Shadows. My name is Alexander. On the outskirts of Ravenford, there lay a forest so foreboding that people trembled to set foot within a forest that seemed like a living entity, carrying the forgotten whispers of the past. The townspeople believed that venturing beyond this forest was cursed, and every night they recounted old tales that dissolved into the howling wind. I, however, was consumed by a burning desire to uncover the truth behind those mysterious whispers. One autumn evening, as the fog thickened and the pale light of the moon danced with the shadows, I could no longer contain my curiosity and took the path into the forest. My footsteps echoed on the damp earth, and the thin mist weaving through the trees seemed to murmur the lost voices of bygone days. Every tree, every leaf appeared to bear the traces of ancient sorrow. My journey led me onto a long-forgotten trail, a path that seemed to hold the imprints of souls who had once wandered it and then vanished. After a while, emerging from the fog before me was the silhouette of what resembled the ruins of an abandoned village. Crumbling stone houses, now condemned to silence, stood like relics, bearing the painful memories of the past. In the center of the village lay a forgotten square with a weathered cross. According to local legend, this village had once been populated by people who struggled against nature's wrath. However, when ancient rituals spiraled out of control, dark forces from the depths of the forest eradicated all hope. When I reached the village gates, an indescribable melancholy overwhelmed me. The walls, worn by years of neglect, seemed to silently whisper the sorrows of long ago. Standing before an old house, watching the faint light leak through shattered windows, I heard a gentle melody. It was as if the forgotten tunes of a music box were playing, a delicate yet profoundly sorrowful tune, drawn by an ethereal invitation. I searched for the source of the sound, and found myself compelled to enter the house. Inside, every corner of the home revealed traces of dusty memories and forgotten recollections. On a table, a faded letter caught my eye. As I took it in my hand, the trembling letters seemed to echo the tragedies of the past. We sacrificed to appease the wrath of nature, yet fury never falls silent. These forgotten lands stand as silent witnesses to our sorrows and losses. Every tear shed, every hope that fades away, reverberates in the shadow of this forest. Those words ignited my curiosity even further, reminding me of the village's curse and the dark face of the forest. With each step I took, the mysterious whispers rising from the depths of the forest made me feel the weight of untold stories. When I closed my eyes, I could almost hear distant, sorrowful screams and the weeping of lost souls. As I wandered among the ruins, I noticed ancient inscriptions and symbols etched into the walls. These markings bore witness to the archaic rituals once performed by the villagers in their quest to become one with Natura, pursuit that ultimately led to calamity. Legend has it that, as the villagers tried to understand the balance and fury of nature, they paid a heavy price, and the curse took deep root within the forest. In the silence of the forest, as I felt as though I were lost within the depths of my own soul, I experienced an inner reckoning with loneliness and despair. Every step reminded me of how fragile life truly is, of the lingering pains of the past and the uncertainty of the future. This abandoned village was more than just a place. It was a silent chronicle of lost hopes, forgotten loves, and deep-seated sorrows. As time passed, and I departed from the village, I carried with me the imprints of those ancient stone structures, the sorrowful stories, and the echoes of forgotten whispers deep within my heart. The forest of shadows had revealed to me both the beauty and the pain of life, the indelible marks of the past, and the uncertain hopes for the future. That night, as I emerged from the forest, I bore within me both an indescribable melancholy and a hidden glimmer of hope amid the darkness. The cursed clock tower me name is Edward. When I first arrived in the town of Windermere, I was unaware of the dark secrets hidden behind its calm facade. As I wandered through the narrow streets and among the ancient stone buildings, an inexplicable sense of unease settled within me. With every step, I felt as though I could hear the echoes of the past and the whispered tales left untold. In the very center of the town stood an old clock tower, defiant against the ravages of time. With its Gothic architecture and moss roof, the tower seemed to herald a curse. Both mesmerizing and eerie, this structure was known by the townspeople simply as the Cursed Clock Tower. Every evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, the toll of its bells would envelop the town in a profound silence, as if reminding everyone of the dark secrets of the past. One evening, driven by an insatiable curiosity, I decided to approach that accursed tower. Despite the fear that churned inside me, the desire to uncover the mystery behind this enigmatic edifice propelled me forward. Under the pale light of the moon, I advanced step by step toward the tower. I recalled the warning of an elderly local who had once said, "Edward, do not go near that tower. Unspeakable sorrows lie within." Yet, unwilling to be satisfied with mere rumors, I sought the truth for myself. I pushed open the heavy door of the tower and stepped inside. The interior was dark, cold, and blanketed in the dust of many years. The echo of my footsteps vanished into the long corridors, and with each step, my heart pounded ever harder. The faded portraits hanging on the walls, remnants of those who once lived in this town, seemed to gaze into the emptiness, each face bearing the scars of a tragedy, a loss. As I ventured deeper, an old book caught my eye on the stairway leading to the bell chamber. Flipping through its dusty pages, I recalled the story of the tower's construction and the master architect, William. According to local lore, William had made a pact during the building of the tower, sealing a dark part of his soul within it in exchange for immortality. The curse of that bargain was said to return with every toll of the bell, determining the fate of the living. When I finally reached the deepest part of the tower, I opened the door to the enormous bell chamber. At that moment, a chill swept through my entire body as if the weight of centuries began to press upon my shoulders. In the center of the room, on an old wooden table, lay an unfinished letter. The moment I picked it up, an indescribable melancholy and apprehension welled within me. I carefully read the faded words on the paper. "O child of time, if you are reading these lines, know that curses are never forgotten. I, William, have sacrificed a part of my soul to this tower. Now every toll of the bell symbolizes a heart's agony, a life lost. The passage of time will be paid for with the price of immortality." Those words ignited my curiosity even further. It became clear to me then that the tower was not merely a building, it was a symbol of the town's history, its sorrows, and its losses. I began to ponder the fragility of my own life, the dark imprints of the past, and the inevitability of death. As the sound of the bells grew nearer, I slowly started to withdraw. Yet it felt as though the mysterious power of the tower would not let me go. Gazing up at the ceiling of the bell chamber, I could almost hear the reverberating pains with every toll. At that moment, a soft melody, as if whispered from beyond time, filled the space. It spoke not only of the tower's sorrow, but of the collective grief of the entire town. I listened in silence for a long while. Each bell strike underscored how fragile life truly is, a stark reminder of my mortality. That night, as I stepped out of the cursed clock tower and merged with the quiet streets of Windermere, I found a new meaning in the silence. Perhaps the curse was not meant to erase the mistakes of the past, but rather to remind us of the pain we have endured. In that moment, I experienced an awakening, a profound realization. I saw in myself the traces of similar sorrows, losses, and errors. And maybe the tower intended to remind us all. Every toll of the bell is a reflection of the past, and every moment of our lives is precious. Now, as I leave that cursed clock tower behind and blend back into the town's streets, I carry both a sorrow and a glimmer of hope within me. Perhaps the pains of the past illuminate the path to the future. Perhaps every loss heralds the promise of a new beginning. My story is but one fragment of what transpired within those walls. Yet, that night, I felt the weight of the curse, the whisper of history, and the true value of life deep within my soul. Michael's lost mission. The cursed sanctuary of the saints me name is Michael. I had just returned from military service, my body still bearing the scars of war. I wasn't a man easily shaken. I had seen things that would haunt most people for a lifetime, but nothing could have prepared me for this place. I went to the hospital for a routine checkup. The waiting room was nearly empty, odd for a hospital of this size. The receptionist barely looked up as she handed me a clipboard. "Please, wait here for a moment," she said. I sat. I waited. Minutes passed. No one called my name. The silence became oppressive. From the hallway to my right, I heard something, a faint, distant weeping. I stood up, my instincts kicking in. I followed the sound. The hallway was long and dimly lit, stretching far beyond what should have been possible inside the building. Then, I saw them. The murals, painted across the walls, illuminated by flickering lights. They depicted saints, but their faces, they were wrong, twisted into expressions of agony and terror, as if they weren't blessed, but cursed. I felt an icy chill creep up my spine. That's when I noticed the man standing at the end of the hallway. He wore a priest's robe, his head bowed, hands clasped in silent prayer. I hesitated. "Sir," I called out. Slowly, he lifted his head, and my stomach twisted in horror. His eyes were missing. Only two hollow sockets stared back at me, yet somehow, he was smiling. The priest turned and opened a wooden door behind him. Then, without a word, he stepped inside and disappeared. I should have walked away. I should have left the hospital and never come back. But something pulled me forward. I followed him inside. I descended a spiral stone staircase, each step taking me deeper into somewhere I wasn't supposed to be. The air grew colder. At the bottom I stepped into a grand hall. It was ancient, nothing like a hospital. It looked more like a medieval cathedral, but far more sinister, mummified. Saints stood in alcoves along the walls, their rotting hands clasped in prayer. At the center of the room, a massive altar stood beneath a domed ceiling. On the altar, there was a book, old leather-bound, and covered in symbols I couldn't understand. But one thing stood out, a phrase carved into the stone beneath it. Sancti maledicti Latin. The cursed saints. Suddenly the bells rang loud, deafening. The sound shook the walls, dust raining from above. I turned to run, but the priest was behind me. He was not alone. Figures in dark robes emerged from the shadows. Their faces were hidden, their whispered prayers filling the air. Then they started chanting my name. Michael, Michael, Michael. I backed away, my heart pounding. Then, the priest spoke. "You have come to repent, soldier. You have come to pay your debt." I shook my head, stepping backward. "I don't know what you're talking about." "But..." The priest only smiled wider. His teeth were too sharp. "Kneel." The chanting grew louder. The walls shook. The saints in the alcoves, they were moving, their dry, skeletal hands unclasped, their heads turned toward me. I heard bones cracking as they took their first steps in centuries. The priest raised his arms. The figures in robes fell to their knees. The altar began to glow with a sickly red light. Something was coming. I ran. I turned and sprinted toward the exit, my breath ragged. The saints' whispers chased me. I bolted through the door and up the spiraling staircase, the bells thundering in my ears. The priest's voice echoed after me. "You cannot escape the saints' judgment." I burst through the door and slammed it shut. The hallway was empty again. The lights were calm, as if nothing had happened. I was back, but I knew I had not escaped. I left the hospital that day. I never returned. I told myself it was all a hallucination, a fever dream, a symptom of exhaustion. But then the bells followed me every night, in my apartment, in my sleep. I hear them, distant at first, but getting closer. And last night, I heard a knock at my door. When I looked through the peephole, there was no one there, just a piece of paper slid under the door. I picked it up with shaking hands. Only 2 words were written on it. "Kneel, now. The saints haven't forgotten me, and I know the truth now." The hospital was never a hospital. It was a sanctuary for the cursed. And once you've entered their domain, they never let you go. Charlotte's forgotten escape. The whispers of the forest me name is Charlotte. My whole life I've been fascinated by the world of medicine, which is why I was thrilled to begin my internship at the hospital. On my first day, I found myself lost in the chaos of bustling doctors and hurried, footsteps. But something felt off. The upper floors of the hospital were under renovation. I heard whispers between staff members. No one goes up there. That section has been closed for years. A normal person would have taken that as a warning, but I've never been normal. So that night, when my shift ended, I stayed behind. I waited until the hallways were empty. Then, silently, I climbed the forbidden staircase. As I reached the top, a wave of cold, rancid air hit me. The entire upper floor was decayed, walls covered in mold and peeling paint. The air was damp, thick with the stench of something rotten. A metal plaque caught my attention. Room 301, former patient ward. The door was slightly open, and from inside, I heard breathing. Not normal breathing. Ragged, wet, like someone drowning in their own lungs. I should have turned back, but my feet moved forward on their own. I stepped inside. The room was filled with empty hospital beds, their sheets torn and soaked in something dark. The floor creaked under my weight, and then I saw it. A dusty, old recording device on a bedside table. I hesitated, then pressed play. A voice crackled to life, hoarse and terrified. Subject 23. Subject 23 is uncontrollable. The patient must be transferred to the forest. The forest. I knew there was a small hospital garden behind the building, but what forest? I glanced around the room, my pulse hammering. That's when the door slammed shut, and the entire hospital shook as if an earthquake had struck. The walls groaned, cracks forming, plaster crumbling to dust. I ran. I threw myself against the door. It wouldn't budge, then silence. Only the faint sound of dripping water. I turned. A hole had appeared in the wall. A passage. Dark, beckoning. I had no choice. I crawled inside. When I emerged, I wasn't in the hospital anymore. I was in a basement. But not just any basement. This place was wrong. The walls were lined with metal shelves, stacked with rusty medical tools and sealed patient files. Everything was covered in dust and cobwebs, as if this place had been forgotten for decades. A single light flickered overhead, casting long shadows. Then, I saw it, a yellowed, crumbling map pinned to the wall. It showed the hospital grounds and beyond it, a massive forest. It shouldn't be there. It wasn't supposed to be there. But the map marked a path, a route labeled and smeared, blood red ink, exit. I grabbed the map and ran. The basement hallway stretched endlessly, twisting and turning in unnatural ways. And then I saw it, a rusted metal door at the very end. My fingers trembled as I turned the handle. It opened with a loud creak, and suddenly I was outside. But this wasn't the hospital garden. A vast, endless forest stretched out before me. The trees were tall, their twisted branches clawing at the blood-red sky. A mist slithered between the roots, swallowing the ground. I turned around. The hospital building was gone, or rather what remained of it was nothing but a rotting skeleton of crumbling bricks and shattered windows. It was as if it had never existed. My breath came in short gasps. I looked back at the map, tracing the path labeled exit. I followed it, my steps slow, careful. The deeper I went, the louder the whispers became. Soft voices, calling my name. Charlotte, you should have never come here. You're not supposed to leave. I kept walking, then movement from the corner of my eye. I saw something tall and thin, standing between the trees. It was watching me. I turned my head fully, and it was gone. But the whispers grew louder. I started running. The trees closed in around me. The sky darkened, as if the forest itself was swallowing me whole. And then I saw it. A cabin. Old. Abandoned. The windows were boarded shut, but the door was open. I had no choice. I ran inside. The moment I stepped in, the door slammed shut behind me. Inside, the air was heavy. The walls were lined with rotting books, their pages covered in scribbled notes and warnings. The only light came from a single lantern, flickering weakly on a wooden table. On the table lay an old journal. I flipped it open, my hands shaking. The first page was scrawled with desperate handwriting. Subject 23 was sent into the forest. It didn't work. The patient changed. The whispers won't stop. There is no escape. I turned to the last page. It was blank, except for 2 words. Look up. A chill ran down my spine. I lifted my gaze to the ceiling, and I saw it. A figure was clinging to the rafters, its head tilted unnaturally to one side. Its eyes were hollow, filled with swirling black mist, and then it lunged. I screamed. I don't remember what happened next. All I know is that when I woke up, I was back at the hospital entrance. The glass doors slid open, as if nothing had happened. Daniel's silent scream. The shadow operating roomie name is Daniel. I know it may sound ordinary, but inside, I am anything but. My mind is fractured, my nerves shredded. I wasn't always like this. I was once a rational person, a man who believed in logic and science. But that was before this place. I will never forget the day it all began. It was a routine checkup at the hospital. A cold winter morning, with a thin layer of snow covering the streets. As I stepped into the building, the first thing I noticed was the silence. The reception desk was empty. No doctors, no nurses, just a single rusty wheelchair, its wheels squeaking softly as if someone had just pushed it. The air smelled of antiseptic and something else, something metallic, like rusted iron. I hesitated but forced myself to walk forward, and that's when I saw the painting. It was massive, hanging ominously on the wall near the entrance. A surreal, Gothic-style artwork depicting a group of surgeons standing around an operating table. Their faces were distorted, twisted into grotesque expressions. The patient on the table was blurred, as if erased. Beneath the painting, a brass plaque read, "The Shadow Operating Room." The title sent a shiver down my spine. I ignored it and walked to the elevator. The metal doors slid open with a groan. The interior was dimly lit. I hesitated. Was it just me, or was someone breathing inside? No, that was impossible. I stepped inside. I pressed the button for the 4th floor. The elevator didn't stop at the 4th floor. It didn't stop at the 5th or the 6th. Instead, it rushed upward faster than normal. I gripped the railing as the numbers blinked rapidly. 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Then a loud thud. The elevator jerked to a stop, and the doors slid open. I stepped out cautiously, my heart hammering. The hallway before me was dark, cold, and silent. Something was wrong to my left. A metal surgical tray had been knocked over, the instruments scattered across the floor. Some of them were covered in dried blood. Above it, smeared across the peeling wallpaper, was a phrase written in what looked like blackened, dried blood. "Every life is an experiment." I backed away, and that's when I heard it. A low, gurgling noise. I turned towards the sound. The door was slightly open, revealing a darkened operating room. I stepped closer, peering inside. Hanging from the ceiling, swaying ever so slightly, were chains. They clinked together softly, as if moved by an unseen force. Beneath them, an old surgical table stood in the center of the room. The restraints were torn, as if something had broken free. I wasn't alone in that room. I felt it before I saw it. A figure moved in the shadows, its body grotesquely contorted. Its arms, or lack thereof, hung limply at its sides. Its head twitched unnaturally, as if its neck was barely holding it up. I wanted to run, but I couldn't. Then, it turned towards me, and I saw its face. Or rather, what was left of it. It had no eyes, only 2 deep empty socket spits of pure darkness. Its mouth was slightly open, and a thick black liquid dripped from its lips. I choked back a scream. My mind screamed at me to move, but my body refused. Then, it took a step forward. I stumbled backward, and my hand hit something solid, a trapdoor, without thinking. I yanked it open and threw myself inside. I fell hard onto a narrow, dark tunnel, my knees scraping against the rough concrete. The air was damp and choked with rot. I crawled forward, forcing myself through the tight, suffocating passage. The tunnel led me to a massive storage room. The ceiling was low, the walls lined with metal shelves filled with sealed biohazard containers. Each one had a label dot, and every single label read the same thing. Test subject, incomplete. I nearly threw up. I turned around and that's when I saw it again. Standing in the doorway, its eyeless sockets locked onto me, its mouth stretched into an unnatural, silent scream. I grabbed the nearest object, a rusted scalpel, and hurled it at the creature. It didn't even flinch. Instead, it rushed forward. I spun and ran, pushing through the shelves, knocking over metal trays, desperate for an exit. Then I saw it, a metal door, bolted shut, a keypad beside it. My hands shook violently as I punched random numbers, praying for a miracle. Beep bop beep dot beep dash click dot. The lock released. I threw open the door and stepped into a long, abandoned corridor. The walls were lined with faded murals, depictions of twisted, monstrous surgeons operating on faceless patients. The exit was near. I could feel it. I sprinted down the corridor, my lungs burning, my legs trembling, and then I saw daylight. A massive window at the end of the hall, with a final burst of energy. I leaped forward, smashing through the glass. Cold air rushed into my lungs. I hit the ground hard, but something was wrong. I wasn't in the hospital anymore. I was in an abandoned asylum courtyard. The hospital was gone, replaced by a crumbling, desolate ruin, as if it had never existed. I turned, my breath coming in sharp. Alice's tears. The abandoned wing's name is Alice. Yes, it might sound strange, but I've always hated hospitals. Ironically, my story begins in one. I had gone to the emergency room for a minor health issue. I was sitting in a standard examination room, waiting for the doctor. I was just about to check the time when, suddenly, the door slammed shut, and the lights went out. The entire room plunged into darkness. I let out a quiet whimper, trying not to panic. Then, a flashlight beam shone under the door. The only thing I could see was the shadowy silhouette of a tall man wearing a long coat. "Do you need help?" he asked, in a voice that sent chills down my spine. Before I could answer, the flashlight beam suddenly shifted right into my face. My eyes stung from the brightness. And then, out of nowhere, I felt something graze the tip of my nose. A sharp, metallic object. A scalpel. The man smirked, and then he vanished into the hallway. My heartbeat pounded like a drum inside my chest. I fumbled for the door handle and yanked it open. The hallway outside was dimly lit by flickering emergency exit signs. I took a deep breath, forcing myself to calm down. That's when I noticed the paintings on the wall. They weren't ordinary hospital artwork. They were portraits of patients' faces, frozen in expressions of agony and despair. Some looked sick, others looked distorted. My stomach twisted when I saw one portrait that looked exactly like me. Below it, a small plaque read, "The new victim." My breath hitched. My legs felt like jelly. This had to be some kind of sick joke. I turned sharply, scanning the hallway. Just a few feet ahead, a doorway caught my eye. The sign above read, "Wing D Block." I'd never heard of a Wing D in this hospital before. I hesitated, staring at the partially open door, and then I heard it. A hissing sound. It wasn't like a human whisper, it was wet, slithering, almost insect-like. I should have turned away. I should have run, but my curiosity betrayed me. I took a cautious step forward and pushed the door open. Inside, the room was not abandoned, as I had expected. A pale blue moonlight streamed through shattered windows, casting eerie shadows across the walls. The room was filled with rusty, iron-framed hospital beds, their sheets torn to shreds. There was something about those sheets. They looked as if someone had clawed through them. And then I saw her. In the farthest corner of the room, a nurse sat slumped over, her head drooped forward. In front of her lay a massive syringe, filled with a dark, viscous liquid. I took a slow step forward. That's when she moved. Her head jerked up, her empty eyes locking onto mine. I felt my heart stop. Something about her face. It wasn't human anymore. Her skin was pale, almost translucent, but her mouth stretched unnaturally wide, as if her lips had been torn apart. Then she screeched and lunged at me. A distorted, inhuman blur raced toward me. I barely had time to react. I turned and ran for my life. The sound of her ragged breathing chased me down the corridor. I could hear her nails scraping against the walls. Getting closer, I made a sharp turn and slammed into a metal door. A single sign was bolted onto it: the abandoned wings. I threw myself inside and locked the door behind me. My chest heaved, my body trembled. The hallway was silent. I turned around. I had entered what looked like a forgotten archive room. Dusty shelves stretched from floor to ceiling, packed with folders, hospital records, and brittle, yellowing papers. Something fluttered from one of the top shelves. A page tore free and drifted to the ground. I picked it up. Dread ink. No, not ink blood. Dozens of names were listed in messy handwriting. Bella, Charles, Donna. Each name had a bloodstain beside it, and at the very bottom my name, Alice. Underneath it, scrawled in shaking letters, was a date and time. Time of death: 3:15 a.m. My vision blurred. The walls felt like they were closing in. Was this a mistake? Some cruel prank? Or was this a prophecy? My hands shook as I scanned the room. My gaze landed on a faded map pinned to the wall. It had a section marked in red ink: secret exit. I didn't think twice. I grabbed the map and ran. I followed the directions through the crumbling hospital corridors, my breath shallow, my pulse wild. Eventually, I reached a massive rusted door at the end of a narrow hallway. Beyond it, I could hear howling wind. I forced it open, and then I wasn't in the hospital anymore. I was standing in the middle of an airfield, an abandoned airport. Runway stretched out before me, bathed in an eerie blood-red glow. The sky wasn't normal. It was dark crimson, as if soaked in frozen blood. Wind howled across the empty tarmac, and then I heard it again, the hissing sound. It was behind me. I turned, but there was nothing there. I started running. I didn't know where I was going, just knew I had to get away. Then, at the far end of the runway, I saw it, a massive aircraft hangar, its doors slightly ajar. Faint flick. Benjamin's journal. The end of the dark corridor. Benjamin. My hands are trembling. My pupils feel constricted, but I have to keep writing. Strange, isn't it? Even when fear pushes someone to the brink of insanity, they cling to words. My starting point remains the same: a hospital room. But don't let the word hospital mislead you. This place is unlike any institution you've ever seen. I've been locked in this room for a week now, or maybe 5 days. I've lost my sense of time. Since the moment I gathered enough strength to step outside, I've been wandering the hallways. I keep hearing noises, the metallic clinking of surgical instruments, eerie moans reverberating through the walls, and doors slamming shut over and over again. I don't know what happens inside the operating room, but a few nights ago, I saw a red glow seeping from beneath the door. It wasn't neon red, more like the deep, thick crimson of blood. As I got closer, the sounds changed. The moaning faded, replaced by high-pitched laughter. It was as if someone inside was enjoying a game. I finally mustered the courage to peek through the door, only to find an empty operating table and thick curtains enclosing a portion of the room. Nothing seemed out of place, but as I turned to leave, I saw something, a shadow shifting across the steel table. It wasn't human or animal. It was more like a formless, swirling darkness. The moment I blinked, it disappeared. Maybe my mind was playing tricks on me. Maybe fear was distorting my senses. But my gut told me otherwise. The next morning, I thought I had made it back to my room, but I hadn't. I realized I was lost inside a dimly lit waiting area. Chairs were overturned, strange symbols were etched into the walls, and right there, in smeared red paint or perhaps dried blood, someone had written, "Follow me." That's when I heard Ita whisper behind me, a woman's voice, fragile and uncertain. "Benjamin, is that you?" I couldn't answer. My tongue felt dry, my throat tightened. Slowly, I turned around. No one was there, just a flickering fluorescent light and the fading echo of a voice that somehow knew my name. I tried to think rationally. Maybe this was a newly constructed or abandoned hospital wing. Maybe the strange echoes and shadows were tricks of the dim lighting. Maybe. But then I saw him at the far end of the hallway. A tall figure stood still. His face was unclear, but I could make out the shredded remains of what was once a hospital gown. His torso was hollowed out, as if something had been violently removed from his chest. In his right hand, he held a scalpel, in his left, a steel tray. He didn't speak. He just started walking towards me. I instinctively stepped back, my foot hitting something solid. A rusted key. I didn't have time to question why it was there. I grabbed it. I dashed into the nearest room, slamming the door shut and locking it. Almost instantly, I heard the sound of metal scraping against the door. The scalpel, he was dragging it across the wood, as if savoring the moment. In the dim light of the room, I spotted an elevator, but it was nothing like the sleek hospital elevators I was used to. It was an old-fashioned, manually operated cage elevator. There was no other option. I tried the key. Against all logic, it fit. The metal doors groaned open, revealing a descending tunnel instead of an elevator shaft. My gut told me I should turn back, but behind me, the scraping at the door had stopped. The silence was far more terrifying. I stepped inside. The doors slammed shut behind me. And then, all at once, I heard whispers from every direction. "Benjamin, there is no way out." Panic surged through me, but my legs moved on their own, pulling me deeper into the tunnel. The ground beneath my feet was slick, covered in moisture. The further I went, the colder the air became. My breath formed white clouds in the damp darkness. Then, I saw it. A cavernous space, opening up into a subterranean morgue. Rows of massive glass containers lined the walls. Each one held twisted, inhuman remains, suspended in murky liquid. Some had no faces at all, just smooth, featureless flesh. Others had deep, hollow eye sockets, as if something had gouged their eyes out. A suffocating sense of dread crushed my chest. My mind screamed at me to run, but my legs felt rooted in place. And then I heard breathing. I turned toward one of the glass containers. Inside, something moved. The shadowy figure from the operating room was floating in the murky liquid. Its shape shifted and twisted, as if struggling to form a body. But the moment I made eye contact, it lunged banging against the glass with an unholy screech. I stumbled backward, nearly collapsing in terror. That was when I saw it, a single metal drawer sticking out from the wall. A morgue slab. Unlike the others, this one had a nameplate on it. My name, Benjamin. My blood ran cold. The drawer was slightly ajar. Against all reason, I reached for it. My fingers trembled as I gripped the handle. The silent passenger. I've spent most of my life working the night shift at the metro station. The job isn't exciting, but it's steady, predictably at least. It used to be. Now, I can't even step into a station without feeling my skin crawl. It started about a month ago. I was the only staff member on duty, working the late shift at an old metro station that had been in operation for decades. The place had its quirks: flickering lights, the occasional power surge, the air always felt just a little too cold. That night, I was sitting in the control room, monitoring the security cameras. Everything was normal. The last train had come and gone, and the platform was empty. Then I saw him, a man, standing completely still at the far end of the platform. At first I thought he had missed the last train, but something about him was off. He wasn't moving. He wasn't pacing or checking his phone like stranded passengers usually do. He was just standing there, perfectly still, staring at the dark tunnel where the train had disappeared. I grabbed the station's microphone and pressed the button to speak over the intercom. "Sir, the last train has already left. We're closing soon." No reaction. I leaned closer to the screen, adjusting the camera angle. He was tall, wearing an old, tattered coat. Something about him made my stomach twist, but I couldn't figure out why. I switched to another camera, one closer to where he was standing, and that's when I realized I couldn't see his face. Not because of the camera quality or the lighting. It was something else. His face was just wrong, blurry, distorted, like the static on an old TV. A shiver crawled down my spine. I turned away from the screen, shaking my head. I was probably just tired. I decided to go down to the platform and escort him out myself. Big mistake. He stepped onto the platform, the sound of my footsteps echoing through the empty station. The air was colder here, much colder than it should have been. I called out, "Sir?" Nothing. I walked toward the far end of the platform, my flashlight casting long shadows across the tiles, and then, just as I reached the spot where I had seen him, he was gone. No footsteps leading away, no sound of movement, just gone. I swallowed hard and turned back toward the stairs, ready to get the hell out of there. Then I heard it, a whisper. At first, I thought it was the wind moving through the tunnels, but then I heard it again, closer this time. My name. I spun around, shining my flashlight into the darkness. Nothing. The station was empty, completely, utterly empty. I walked back up the stairs to the control room, forcing myself to breathe normally. Maybe I had imagined it. Maybe the security cameras had glitched, and the man had just left without me noticing. I sat back down, my heart still pounding. I flipped through the camera feeds again, and that's when I saw the train. The last train. It was impossible. The system was shut down. There were no more scheduled arrivals. But there it was, captured on the platform camera, train pulling into the station without a driver. The doors slid open with a slow, mechanical hiss, and then he stepped inside. The man, the one who had been standing on the platform. Except now, he wasn't facing the tunnel, he was facing the camera. I froze. My breath caught in my throat. I could see his face now, or rather, the absence of one where his features should have been. There was nothing but shifting darkness, like a void. Like the tunnel itself had swallowed him whole. The train doors slid shut. The lights flickered, and then the train was gone. Vanished. No record of it. No trace on the system logs, just gone. After Mothi quit my job the next morning, I didn't explain why. How could I? Who would believe me? But I've started noticing things every night. At exactly 3:17 a.m., I hear the sound of a distant train whistle. Even when I'm miles from any station, even when I know there shouldn't be one, and sometimes when I walk past darkened subway entrances, I swear I see him standing there waiting for the next train. The whispering wind on the farmy was never one to believe in ghosts, curses, or the supernatural. I've spent my life working on this farm, just like my father and his father before him. The land has always been good to us until the night everything changed. It started with the wind. The farm had always been a quiet place, peaceful in a way that made you feel grounded. The wind would rustle through the fields. The crickets would sing at night. and the rhythm of life stayed predictable. But one evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, the air shifted. The wind wasn't normal that night. It wasn't the kind that came in soft waves or sudden gusts. It was a whispering wind, moving through the fields in unnatural patterns, carrying voices, low murmuring, almost human voices. At first I thought it was my mind playing tricks on me. I had been working late, and exhaustion could do strange things. But the more I listened, the more certain I became. It wasn't just the wind. It was something inside the wind. I stepped onto the porch, scanning the fields. The barn stood tall in the distance, its doors slightly ajar. I frowned. I always made sure to shut them tight at night. With a sigh, I grabbed my flashlight and started walking. As I got closer, the whispering grew louder. It wasn't coming from the barn, it was coming from the fields. Something was moving through the tall crops. I shined my light toward the noise. The corn stalks rustled, parting ever so slightly, but I couldn't see anything inside. The wind picked up, carrying the whispers past my ears. I swear, I heard my name. I took a step back, gripping the flashlight tighter. "Hello." My voice sounded small against the vast, empty land. No answer. Then, something moved. A shape just barely visible between the stalks. A figure too tall, too thin, its body swaying with the wind as if it was part of it. My stomach twisted. Then it stopped swaying. It turned, and it looked at me. I can't explain how I knew. I couldn't see a face, couldn't make out any features. But I felt its gaze, heavy and unnatural, drilling into me like an unspoken warning. The whispering became a chant, overlapping voices weaving together in an unsettling harmony. I took a shaky step back. The figure didn't move. It just stood there, watching, waiting. Then, the wind stopped. Complete silence. No crickets, no rustling leaves, no distant hum of the night. Just nothing. A second later, the barn door slammed shut behind me with a force that rattled the walls. I spun around, heart hammering in my chest. The entire farm seemed to be holding its breath. When I turned back toward the field, the figure was gone. I didn't sleep that night. I kept every light on, every door locked. I sat on the couch with my shotgun across my lap, listening to the silence, waiting for the whispering to return. It didn't, not that night, but the next morning, as I walked outside, I found something that chilled me to my core. Footprints leading from the field to my house. And then they stopped. No return tracks. No signs of where the thing had gone. Just a perfect trail leading straight to my porch, ending inches from the door. As if it had been standing there, watching me. I wanted to pack my bags and leave right then. But this farm, this land had been in my family for generations. I wasn't going to be scared off by something I couldn't even explain. But that night, the whispering returned. I barely stepped outside before I heard it, soft at first, almost like a sigh carried on the wind. Then louder, clearer, closer. This time, it didn't just call my name. It pleaded, "Let me in." I slammed the door and locked it. Whatever was out there, it wasn't human. It wasn't some lost traveler or prankster trying to scare me. It was something else, something that had been waiting, watching, learning. I didn't sleep for 3 nights after that. I kept the lights on, the doors shut, the shotgun loaded. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that shape in the fields, swaying, whispering, waiting. Then, one night, the whispering stopped. The wind returned to normal. The farm fell back into its familiar rhythm, and for a brief moment, I allowed myself to believe it was over, but it wasn't. A week later, I found something in the barn. At first, I thought it was just an old scarecrow, toppled over in the hay. But as I got closer, I saw that it wasn't stuffed with straw. It was filled with bones, human bones. That was the final straw. I packed my bags and left the farm that same day. I don't know who or what left that thing in my barn, and I don't want to know. But sometimes, even miles away, even in the safety of my new home, I hear the wind whisper, and sometimes, just before I fall asleep, I swear I hear a voice right outside my window. Let me in. The shadows beneath the waves. I've spent my whole life in the ocean. Diving has always been my escape, my passion, my second home. But after what I saw that day, I swore I would never set foot in the water again. It started like any other dive. I had heard stories, local legends, about a shipwreck that had vanished decades ago, swallowed by the sea under strange circumstances. Most people believed it was just a myth, but I had spoken to other divers who claimed to have seen parts of it hidden deep beneath the waves. I wanted to see it for myself. With my gear secured and my oxygen tank full, I slipped beneath the surface, letting the water swallow me whole. The descent was smooth. Schools of fish darted past me, and the sunlight above danced on the ocean floor. I took a deep breath through my regulator, exhaling slowly as I searched for the wreck. Then, I saw it. A jagged structure loomed ahead, its rusted hull half buried in the sand. As I swam closer, the full shape of the ship came into view. Metal, shattered wood, gaping holes where the ocean had claimed its prize. That's when I felt it. The water around me had changed. It was darker here, even though I hadn't gone that deep. The temperature had dropped, an unnatural cold that seeped through my wetsuit and into my bones. The silence was suffocating. Even the fish had disappeared. Something was wrong. I tried to shake off the feeling and pressed forward, shining my light through the broken windows of the wreck. Inside, scattered objects lay frozen in time, tools, equipment, even the remains of furniture. It was eerily intact. Then, something moved. At first, it was just a flicker, a shadow shifting in my peripheral vision. My breath hitched as I turned, sweeping my light across the wreckage. Nothing, just the ship, silent and undisturbed. I told myself I was imagining things. The isolation, the darkness, it could play tricks on the mind. Then I saw it again. This time, it wasn't just a shadow. It was a shape, a figure. Something was inside the wreck. My pulse pounded in my ears as I hovered just outside the ship. I wasn't alone down here, but that was impossible. There were no other divers scheduled for the day. Slowly, I swam toward the opening of the wreck, my fingers tightening around my flashlight. I peered inside. The darkness was thick, swirling like ink, shifting as if something was moving just beyond the reach of my light. And then, I saw them. Two eyes, cold, empty, watching me from the abyss. My lungs tightened. My instincts screamed at me to move, but my body was frozen. The figure didn't swim, didn't drift. It stood there, unaffected by the currents. Then, ever so slightly, it tilted its head. Distorted and impossible in the deep rippled through the water. A deep, vibrating hum that rattled through my bones. It wasn't a fish. It wasn't a diver. This thing did not belong here. Panic surged through me. I kicked hard, pushing away from the ship, my breath coming in frantic bursts. Bubbles erupted around me as I fought against the crushing silence of the deep. I didn't look back. I couldn't. As I ascended, the water grew colder, the pressure wrapping around me like an iron grip. I could still feel it watching me. Even though I was leaving, it knew me now. Breaking through the surface, I gasped for air, flailing toward the boat. Hands grabbed me, pulling me aboard, voices shouting, asking what had happened. But I couldn't answer. I just stared back at the water, waiting, expecting that thing to rise after me. It never did. I never spoke about what I saw that day. I left the ocean behind, walked away from the only life I had ever known. But sometimes, in the dead of night, when the world is silent and I am alone with my thoughts, I hear it, that deep, droning hum, calling me back to the depths. The shrouded figure in the mountain cabine, A.M. Emily. I never believed in ghosts or the supernatural. At least, Not until I spent that night alone in my family's mountain cabin. Looking back, I wish I had never gone there. The cabin had been in my family for decades. My grandparents had built it as a retreat from the chaos of city life. After they passed, my parents kept it maintained, but rarely visited. It was nestled deep in the mountains, surrounded by endless pine trees, far from any neighbors or towns. My parents warned me about staying there alone, not because of ghosts, but because of how isolated it was. Still, I craved solitude. I had just gone through a brutal breakup, and I needed time away from everything: work, my phone, the noise of the city. So, I packed my bags, stocked up on supplies, and drove up into the mountains. The first day was peaceful. I spent my time reading by the fireplace, taking a short hike along a nearby trail, and simply enjoying the stillness. It was exactly what I needed, but as the sun dipped below the horizon, something changed. The atmosphere in the cabin felt off. The silence was different. It wasn't peaceful anymore. It was oppressive, unnatural. It was as if the entire forest was holding its breath. I shook off the feeling and went about my evening. I made dinner, poured myself some wine, and curled up on the couch with my book. The wind howled outside, rattling the windows, but that was normal. What wasn't normal, however, was the feeling that I was being watched. I tried to ignore it, but my eyes kept drifting toward the large window that overlooked the forest. The porch light barely illuminated the tree line. For a moment, I thought I saw something, a figure standing just beyond the reach of the light. But when I blinked, it was gone. I told myself I was imagining things, that my mind was playing tricks on me. But I still locked all the doors and checked the windows twice before heading to bed. The first night summertime, in the middle of the night, I woke up to a strange sound, a soft, rhythmic scratching. It was coming from the far wall of the cabin. I lay frozen in bed, holding my breath, listening. It was slow, deliberate, as if something or someone was tracing patterns along the wooden exterior. I reached for my phone, but the battery had died. Great. I had left my charger in the car, and there was no way I was going outside. The scratching continued for what felt like an eternity before stopping abruptly. Then came the knock. 3 slow, heavy knocks. Knock. Knock. I clamped my hand over my mouth to keep from gasping. No one should have been up here. No one even knew I was here. Then I heard it. A whisper that drifted through the keyhole. So faint, I almost thought I had imagined it. Emily. I stumbled backward, heart hammering in my chest. The voice was raspy, unnatural. It didn't sound like someone calling my name. It sounded like something trying to remember how to say it. I locked myself in my bedroom and stayed awake until the sun rose. The second night he should have left that morning. I don't know why I didn't. Maybe I convinced myself it had all been a bad dream. Maybe I thought that whatever it was wouldn't come back. I was wrong. That night, it returned. The sun set, and as the sky darkened, my fear grew. I sat on the couch, gripping my phone, waiting for something to happen, and then it did. The knocking started again. Knock. But this time, it wasn't just the door. It came from the walls, the windows, even the roof. And then I heard the voice again. Emily, let me in. I gripped my phone so tightly my knuckles ached. I opened the camera app and pointed it at the window, barely able to breathe. And then, it moved. The thing outside stepped closer, just enough that I could see it more clearly. Its face, if it even had one, was a distorted mass of shadows, shifting and writhing as if it couldn't settle on a single form. I screamed. The escape. Don't remember making the decision to run. One moment, I was frozen in terror, and the next, I was grabbing my keys and bolting for the front door. The second I stepped outside, the temperature plummeted. My breath turned to mist as I sprinted toward my car. Something moved behind me. I didn't dare look. I fumbled with the keys, hands shaking uncontrollably. When I finally managed to unlock the door, I threw myself inside and turned the ignition. The headlights flickered on, and for the first time, I saw it clearly. The figure stood at the edge of the forest, its twisted form barely distinguishable from the trees around it, but its face was grinning. I slammed the car into reverse and sped down the mountain road, barely able to see through the tears, blurring my vision. Mysterious whispers in the forest AM, Lucy. Even as I write this, my skin crawls with fear. The only reason I'm telling this story is to prove that what we experienced was real. When Jason and I decided to go camping in the wilderness for a few days, it seemed like an ordinary adventure. But we realized too late that we were not alone in that forest. The first couple of days were enjoyable. We sat by the fire, told stories, and gazed at the stars. Nature was breathtaking, yet I couldn't shake the feeling of unease deep inside me. At first, I thought it was just my mind adjusting to the environment, but on the second night, I woke up to a strange whisper, and that was when I knew something was very wrong. At first, I thought it was just the wind, but the whispers were structured, almost like someone was speaking. I nudged Jason and whispered, "Jason, do you hear that?" He stirred slightly, but didn't wake up. I sat still, listening intently. The sound seemed to come from just outside our tent, but whenever I tried to pinpoint its source, it shifted, always staying just out of reach, as if luring me out. The whispers suddenly stopped, but I could sense something moving in the forest. Straining my eyes, I thought I saw a shadowy figure lurking in the bushes. My body froze with fear. Swallowing my panic, I retreated into the tent and shook Jason awake. "There's something out there," I whispered, my voice barely audible. But how could I even explain what I had seen? The next morning, I told Jason everything. He laughed at first, but stopped when he saw how serious I was. "Maybe it was just an animal," he suggested. But I knew better. Something was watching us that day. We decided to explore the area around our camp. As we walked, we stumbled upon strange tracks in the soil. They resembled human footprints, but they were unnaturally large and spaced too far apart, as if whatever had left them wasn't walking, it was leaping. That night, the whispers returned. This time, Jason heard them, too. We sat frozen by the fire, listening. Then, from the shadows, I saw it again, a silhouette shifting in the darkness. Jason shone his flashlight, but the instant the beam landed on the figure, it vanished. Back inside the tent, the whispers grew louder, clearer. No longer a single voice, but many, overlapping, whispering urgently. My heart pounded in my chest. I pulled out my phone and started recording. The rustling outside grew heavier and slow. Deliberate footsteps circled our tent. We held our breath, paralyzed. At dawn, I immediately played back the recording. My blood ran cold. The whispers had formed words. "Go back. You do not belong here." We decided to leave that very day. As we packed up, the eerie sense of being watched intensified. Whatever it wasn't done with us yet. As we pulled out the last tent stake, the wind suddenly died. The entire forest fell into an unnatural silence. No birds, no insects, just a heavy, oppressive stillness. Jason turned to me, whispering, "Lucy, something is very wrong." That was when we heard it. A long, deep wail echoed from within the trees. It sounded almost human, but not quite. My whole body went rigid with fear. I clenched my teeth to keep from screaming. Jason grabbed my arm, and we ran to the car. As Jason started the engine, I glanced at the back seat. For a split second, I saw it, a hazy, shadowy figure sitting there, watching us. We sped down the dirt road, desperate to escape, but I knew, deep down, we were still being watched. The misty handprint on the car window told me one thing: our story was far from over.